The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Martha Lowell's hands trembled as she clutched the crumpled letter that wasn't meant for her. In 48 hours, she would stand before a man who'd promised his heart to someone else, her beautiful sister who'd fled in the night, leaving Martha to bear the shame of a broken contract. Plain, overlooked, and desperate to save her family from ruin, Martha had become the replacement bride nobody wanted. But as the Wyoming dust settled around her worn boots, she made a vow. She would tell him the truth, even if it destroyed her only chance at escape. Stay with me until the very end of this story and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far Martha's journey has traveled across the world. The morning Martha Lowell's life changed forever began like every other morning in the cramped Nebraska farmhouse, with the acrid smell of desperation and the sound of her father's anger echoing through the thin walls. "She's gone! That selfish, ungrateful girl has run off like a coward!" Martha stood frozen at the base of the stairs, her work-roughened hands gripping the banister as her father's words crashed through the early dawn silence. She knew, even before she saw the empty bedroom, even before she read the hastily scrawled note left on her sister's pillow, that Catherine had finally done what she'd threatened to do for weeks. She'd run. "Martha, get down here now!" Her father's voice cracked with a fury born of fear, and Martha descended the stairs with the slow, steady steps of someone walking toward their execution. The kitchen was cold despite the struggling fire in the hearth. Her mother sat at the scarred wooden table, face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her father paced like a caged animal, Catherine's goodbye letter crumpled in his fist. "Read it," he commanded, thrusting the paper toward Martha. With fingers that felt numb, Martha smoothed out the wrinkled note. Catherine's elegant handwriting, so different from Martha's own practical script, danced across the page in loops and flourishes that seemed to mock the devastating message they carried. "Dearest family, I cannot do this. I cannot condemn myself to a life of drudgery with a man I've never met in a godforsaken territory where civilization ends and wilderness begins. I know you'll call me selfish, but I'd rather be selfish than buried alive on some lonely ranch, watching my beauty fade into dust and wind. Thomas Whitmore has promised to take me to Boston, where I can have a real life. Please forgive me, but I must choose myself. Your loving daughter, Catherine." Boston! Her father spat the word like poison, with that smooth-talking snake oil salesman who's probably married in 3 states already. Martha's mother finally lifted her head, her face aged 10 years in a single night. "What are we going to do, Henry? The contract is signed. Caleb Turner has sent the money for passage. He's expecting a bride in 4 days' time." 4 days. Martha felt the walls of the small kitchen pressing in on her. Her father stopped pacing and turned to face Martha with an expression that made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger anymore. It was calculation. "No," Martha whispered, understanding blooming like a dark flower in her chest. "Papa, no." "You'll go in her place." The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. "Henry, she can't," her mother began, but her father cut her off with a savage gesture. "She can and she will." "Do you understand what will happen if we break this contract? Turner will demand his money back. Money we've already spent on seed and supplies. We'll be ruined. The whole county will know we raised a daughter who broke a sworn agreement. No decent man will come near this family. Your sons will never find wives. We'll be pariahs." Martha's throat constricted. She looked at her mother, desperately seeking an ally, but saw only defeat in those tired eyes. "Martha isn't—" Her mother hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't wound. "She isn't what he's expecting. He's expecting a wife who can work, who knows farm life, who won't faint at the sight of blood or dirt. Martha knows all of that better than Catherine ever did." Her father's voice softened slightly, which was somehow worse than his anger. "You're a good girl, Martha, strong, capable. You'll make him a far better wife than your sister ever would have." The praise felt like ashes in Martha's mouth. All her life she'd been the sturdy one, the reliable one, the one who stayed behind while Catherine drew every eye in church, at dances, at harvest celebrations. Catherine with her golden curls and rosebud mouth. Catherine who could make men stumble over their own feet with a single smile. And Martha, plain, brown-haired Martha with her sun-weathered skin and calloused hands, had watched from the shadows, accepting long ago that some women were meant to be admired while others were meant to be useful. He asked for Catherine, Martha said quietly. He saw her photograph. He wrote letters to her, not to me. He asked for a bride, her father corrected. A woman who could manage a ranch household. You're more qualified than Catherine ever was. He'll send me back the moment he sees me. Her father's jaw tightened. Then you'll make sure he doesn't. You'll work harder than any woman he's ever known. You'll prove yourself indispensable before he has a chance to refuse you. You're asking me to lie to him. I'm asking you to save this family. The shout reverberated through the small house. Upstairs, Martha heard one of her younger brothers stir, mumbling in confusion. Her mother spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Martha, dear, perhaps this is for the best. You're 23. There are no prospects here. At least in Wyoming. At least in Wyoming, I might find a husband who doesn't care that I'm not beautiful, Martha finished, the bitterness surprising even herself. Her mother flinched. That's not what I meant. But it was exactly what she meant, and they all knew it. Martha walked to the window and stared out at the struggling farm that had been her entire world. The fields were parched, the barn sagging, the fence posts leaning like old men too tired to stand straight. 3 hard years of drought had taken everything but their stubborn pride, and now even that was being asked of her. When does the stage leave? She asked, her voice flat. Tomorrow afternoon. You'll travel to Cheyenne and then take the connecting coach to Clearwater Ridge. Her father's relief was palpable. I've written to Turner explaining that there was a change in circumstances, that you'll be arriving instead. Martha spun around. You told him? I told him Catherine had taken ill and that her older sister would be coming to fulfill the contract. The rest you'll explain when you arrive. Of course. Let Martha deliver the news that would shatter whatever vision Caleb Turner had built from Catherine's photograph and carefully crafted letters. Let Martha stand before a stranger and watch his face fall when he realized what poor bargain fate had dealt him. I won't lie to him, Martha said firmly. When I arrive, I'll tell him everything. I'll tell him Catherine ran away. I'll tell him I was sent as a replacement, and I'll tell him he's free to refuse me and send me back. Her father's expression darkened. You'll do no such thing. Those are my terms, Papa. I'll go. I'll honor the contract as best I can, but I won't start a marriage with deception. He deserves to know the truth. For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other across the worn kitchen table. Finally, her father nodded, though his jaw remained tight with disapproval. Fine. Tell him whatever you want, but you'll go and you'll try. That's all I ask. It wasn't all he asked. It was everything Martha had, and they both knew it. The rest of that day passed in a blur of preparation. Martha packed her few belongings in Catherine's traveling trunk, each item a reminder of the life her sister had rejected. The carefully embroidered linens their mother had made for Catherine's trousseau, the good wool coat their father had purchased in town, the leather-bound Bible inscribed with Catherine's name, everything meant for the golden daughter, now handed down to the plain one like ill-fitting hand-me-downs. That evening, Martha sat at the small desk in the room she'd shared with Catherine and stared at the letters bound with ribbon, Caleb Turner's letters to her sister. She'd watched Catherine read them with barely concealed disdain, tossing them aside after a cursory glance. Now, with trembling hands, Martha untied the ribbon and read them herself. The first letter was formal, almost stiff, a man clearly uncomfortable with the practice of courting through correspondence. Miss Catherine Lowell, I am writing to you at the suggestion of Mrs. Adelaide Hart, who speaks highly of your family. I am in need of a wife to help manage my ranch in the Wyoming Territory. I understand this is an unconventional approach, but the territory is harsh and isolated, and finding a suitable partner through traditional means has proven difficult. Martha could almost hear the hesitation in those words, the pride of a man forced by circumstance to advertise for companionship like he might advertise for a hired hand. The subsequent letters grew warmer, responding to whatever Catherine had written in reply. He described his ranch, 2,000 acres of grazing land in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains. He wrote of long winters and violent springs, of cattle lost to wolves and streams that ran dry under merciless summer suns. He was honest about the hardships, perhaps too honest for a man trying to woo a bride, but interspersed with the harsh realities were glimpses of something else. Descriptions of sunrises that painted the mountains gold, of wild horses running free across endless plains, of a sky so vast and full of stars it made a man feel both infinitely small and somehow larger than he'd ever been. "This land breaks weak men," he'd written in one letter. "But for those strong enough to meet it on its own terms, it offers a kind of freedom that can't be found anywhere else. I won't promise you comfort or ease, Miss Lowell, but I can promise you a partnership built on honest work and mutual respect. I can promise you a place that needs you, not as ornament, but as essential foundation." Martha's throat tightened as she read those words. Catherine had laughed at them, had called Caleb Turner a rough-handed rancher with more poetry than sense. But Martha heard something different in the careful lines, the voice of a man who understood loneliness, who'd built something worth protecting, and who was brave enough to reach out across impossible distance for connection. The final letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, confirming the arrangements and enclosing a photograph. Martha picked up the small tintype with careful fingers. The image was slightly blurred, taken outdoors in harsh sunlight that created sharp shadows across strong features. Caleb Turner stood beside a split-rail fence, one hand resting on a post, the other holding his hat at his side. He was tall. Even in the photograph, his height was evident, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build that spoke of hard physical labor. His face was difficult to read in the imperfect image, but Martha could make out a strong jaw, dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes that looked directly at the camera with an intensity that made her breath catch. He wasn't classically handsome, his features were too rough, too weathered, but there was something compelling about him, a sense of barely contained energy and will. He looked like a man who'd built his life with his own two hands and defended it against whatever the territory threw at him. And he was expecting Catherine, beautiful, delicate Catherine who'd never mucked out a stable or butchered a chicken in her life. Martha carefully returned the letters to their ribbon and placed them in her trunk. Tomorrow she would board a stagecoach heading west into territory she'd only seen on maps. In 4 days she would stand before the stranger and shatter whatever dreams he'd built from ink and paper. She slept fitfully that night, haunted by dreams of vast empty spaces and eyes that saw through every defense she'd ever built. The morning of her departure dawned gray and cold. Martha dressed in her best traveling dress, a practical brown wool that Catherine had rejected as too plain, and braided her hair in a tight coronet that would survive days of rough travel. Her mother pressed a small purse of coins into her hand. "For emergencies," she whispered. "And Martha, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry it has to be this way." Martha embraced her mother, feeling the older woman's thin frame shake with suppressed tears. "It's all right, Mama. Perhaps he'll be kind about it." "And if he's not? If he sends you back?" Martha pulled away and met her mother's eyes steadily. "Then I'll come home, and we'll face whatever comes together." But they both knew there would be no coming home. The money was spent, the contract signed. Martha's only choices were to make this work or to disappear into the vast Western territory and start over with nothing but the clothes on her back and the few coins in her purse. The stagecoach station was a squat building on the edge of town, surrounded by the smell of horses and axle grease. A handful of other passengers waited on the wooden platform, 2 men in business suits, an older woman with a severe face and expensive luggage, and a young mother with a baby that cried incessantly. Martha stood apart from them, her small trunk at her feet, watching as the driver and his assistant checked the rigging and loaded baggage. "Martha Lowell?" She turned to find Pastor Richardson approaching, his round face creased with concern. He'd been the one to initially suggest the match, corresponding with Mrs. Hart in Wyoming, who knew Caleb Turner and vouched for his character. "Pastor," Martha greeted him quietly, "I heard about the change in circumstances." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I want you to know that I wrote to Mrs. Hart explaining the situation. She'll be there when you arrive in Clearwater Ridge, and she's promised to help you get settled." "Does Mr. Turner know?" Martha asked. "Does he know it's me coming instead of Catherine?" The pastor shifted his weight. "Your father sent a telegram saying there had been a change, that Catherine's sister would be fulfilling the contract. I don't know what details were included." "Of course not. Her father would have been as vague as possible, postponing the reckoning until Martha was too far away to easily return. "I see. Thank you for writing to Mrs. Hart. It will be comforting to have a friend there." "Martha," the pastor gripped her arm gently, "I know this isn't how you imagined your life would unfold, but God works in mysterious ways. Perhaps this is exactly where you're meant to be." Martha managed a weak smile. "Perhaps." The driver called for passengers to board. Martha picked up her small carry bag while two men hefted her trunk onto the rear platform. "All aboard for westbound service, Cheyenne, Clearwater Ridge, and points west." Martha climbed into the coach and found a seat by the window. Through the dusty glass, she watched the pastor wave, watched the familiar buildings of her hometown scroll past as the driver cracked his whip and the horses lurched into motion. She didn't cry. There was a strange relief in finally moving, in having the decision made and the journey begun. For years, she'd felt trapped in a life too small for her restless heart, watching opportunities pass by like ships she could never board. Now she was aboard, heading toward the unknown, and if fear gripped her chest like an iron band, well, at least she was finally moving. The first day of travel was brutal. The coach rocked and swayed over rutted roads, throwing passengers against each other with bone-jarring regularity. The baby cried for hours while its exhausted mother tried every trick to soothe it. The businessmen argued politics in loud voices. The older woman complained about everything from the dust to the heat to the lack of proper facilities. Martha sat in silence, watching the landscape change outside her window. The familiar farmland of Nebraska gave way to rolling prairie, then to rougher country where grass grew tall and golden, rippling like waves under the endless wind. They stopped at way stations where passengers could eat questionable food and stretch their cramped legs. Martha barely tasted what she ate, her mind churning with scenarios of what awaited her. Would Caleb Turner be angry? Disappointed? Would he look at her with disgust and immediately arrange her return passage? Or would he be kind in his rejection, perhaps offering her work as a housekeeper before sending her on her way? The worst possibility, one she barely dared consider, was that he might keep her out of obligation, yoking himself to a wife he didn't want out of some misguided sense of honor or desperation. That, Martha decided, she could not allow. Better to be rejected outright than to spend her life as a burden born in grim silence. On the second day, they reached Cheyenne. The city was rawer than anything Martha had ever seen, a jumble of buildings that seemed thrown together in haste, full of rough men and women who walked with the swagger of people who'd left civilization's rules behind. She had 4 hours between coaches, which she spent in the ladies' waiting room of the station, avoiding the curious stares of strangers and trying to eat a meal that sat in her stomach like lead. When the westbound coach was announced, Martha gathered her courage and her belongings and climbed aboard a vehicle even more weathered than the first. This time there were only 3 other passengers, a grizzled man who smelled of whiskey and tobacco, a young cowboy who couldn't have been more than 17, and a woman in her 30s with hard eyes and a mouth painted too red. The landscape grew wilder. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still white with snow despite the summer heat. The roads became rougher, little more than tracks carved through prairie and sagebrush. They forded streams and climbed steep grades that made the horses strain in their traces. Martha watched it all with a mixture of awe and terror. This was truly frontier, raw, untamed, and utterly indifferent to human comfort or survival. On the third day, the driver announced they'd enter Clearwater Ridge territory by afternoon. Martha's hands began to shake. She pulled out Caleb Turner's letters one more time, reading them with desperate attention, as if she might find some clue to the man she would soon face. But the letters revealed only what she already knew. He was honest, hardworking, and lonely. He wanted a partner, not a decoration, and he was expecting someone who looked nothing like the plain, weathered woman currently clutching his words like a lifeline. The coach crested a ridge, and suddenly the valley of Clearwater Ridge spread below them. A small settlement clustered around a main street, perhaps 20 buildings in all, including what looked like a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of houses. Beyond the town, scattered ranches dotted the valley, connected by rough roads and bounded by magnificent mountains that rose like cathedral walls on all sides. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way that made Martha's chest tighten. The coach rolled into town, wheels crunching on the dirt street. A few people glanced up from their business, but the arrival of the weekly stage was apparently common enough not to warrant much attention. "Clearwater Ridge," the driver called. 15-minute stop before we head to points north. Martha's heart hammered so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs from the inside. This was it. The moment of truth she'd been dreading for 3 days of hard travel. She climbed down from the coach on shaking legs, nearly stumbling on the step. The young cowboy caught her elbow, steadying her with a gap-toothed grin. "Careful there, miss." "Thank you," Martha managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Martha Lowell?" She had turned to find a woman in her 50s approaching, plump, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple calico dress and an expression of warm welcome that immediately eased some of Martha's tension. "Mrs. Hart?" Martha guessed. "The very same. Oh, my dear, you must be exhausted. Come, let's get you somewhere you can freshen up before—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening. "Oh my, you're not— that is, I was expecting—" Martha's stomach plummeted. Even Mrs. Hart, who'd never met Catherine, could see immediately that something was wrong. "I'm not Catherine," Martha said quietly. "My sister, she changed her mind. I came instead." Mrs. Hart's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and then settled into something like concern. "Does Caleb know?" "Not the details. My father sent a telegram saying there was a change, but I don't think he explained exactly what that meant." Martha straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to meet the older woman's eyes. "I intend to tell him the truth immediately. He has every right to refuse me and send me back." Mrs. Hart studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, that's honest of you at least. Come along then. He's waiting at my house. Thought it would be more proper than meeting you at the station with half the town watching." They walked down the dusty street, Martha's legs feeling increasingly unsteady with each step. Mrs. Hart kept up a stream of nervous chatter about the town, the weather, the community, clearly trying to fill the terrible silence with anything except the looming confrontation. They reached a neat white house at the edge of town. Mrs. Hart paused at the gate, her hand on Martha's arm. "For what it's worth, dear, Caleb Turner is a good man. Gruff sometimes, and he's had his share of hardship, but he's fair. Whatever happens, he'll treat you decently." Small comfort, but Martha nodded her thanks. They climbed the porch steps. Mrs. Hart opened the door and called out, "Caleb, she's here." Martha heard the scrape of a chair, heavy footsteps, and then he appeared in the doorway of what must be the parlor, and all the air left Martha's lungs in a rush. The photograph hadn't done him justice, or perhaps it had, and Martha simply wasn't prepared for the reality of his physical presence. He was taller than she'd imagined, broad-shouldered and lean, his body that of a man who'd spent his life in hard labor. Dark hair touched with premature gray at the temples, strong features bronzed by sun and wind, and eyes, piercing blue-gray eyes that looked at her with an intensity that made her want to step backward. Those eyes widened slightly as they took her in, and Martha watched his expression shift from anticipation to confusion to something she couldn't quite read. "Mr. Turner," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm Martha Lowell. I need to tell you the truth about why I'm here." The silence that followed Martha's words stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. Caleb Turner stood motionless in the doorway, his blue-gray eyes moving slowly from Martha's face to Mrs. Hart, and back again, as if trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. "The truth," he repeated, his voice low and rough, like gravel rolling in a creek bed. "I see." Mrs. Hart cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should all sit down. I'll make some tea." "No." Caleb's single word stopped her mid-turn. His gaze hadn't left Martha. "I'd like to hear what Miss Lowell has to say standing right here." Martha's throat felt dry as sun-baked earth, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. If she was going to be rejected, and she was almost certain she would be, she'd face it head-on rather than cowering. "Catherine is my younger sister," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "She's the one who corresponded with you. She's the one in the photograph you received. 3 nights ago, she ran away with a traveling salesman rather than come west to marry you." The words came out flat, stripped of emotion, a recitation of facts that felt surreal even as she spoke them. My father sent me in her place to fulfill the contract. He believed— She paused, forcing herself to continue. He believed it was better to send someone, anyone, rather than break the agreement entirely. Caleb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And you agreed to this? I had little choice in the matter, but I made my father promise that I could tell you the truth immediately upon arrival. Martha straightened her shoulders, calling on every ounce of pride she possessed. I'm here to honor the contract if you'll have me, Mr. Turner. But I won't begin a marriage built on deception. You expected someone else, someone younger, prettier, probably more refined than I am. I understand completely if you wish to refuse me and arrange for my return passage. I won't hold it against you, and I'll make sure my family repays whatever expenses you've incurred. The words hung in the air between them. Martha could hear the ticking of a clock somewhere in the house, the distant sound of a dog barking, the rustle of Mrs. Hart's skirts as she shifted uncomfortably. Caleb's expression was unreadable, carved from the same granite as the mountains that surrounded this valley. He studied Martha with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze, refusing to flinch. Mrs. Hart, he said finally, still looking at Martha, could you give us a few minutes? Caleb, I don't think it's proper for— Please. The older woman hesitated, then nodded. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. She touched Martha's arm briefly as she passed, a small gesture of support before disappearing down the hallway. Caleb gestured toward the parlor. Sit. It wasn't quite a command, but it wasn't a request either. Martha moved into the small, neat room and perched on the edge of a horsehair sofa that had seen better days. Caleb remained standing, one hand gripping the back of a chair, the other hanging loose at his side. How old are you? He asked. 23. Your sister? 19. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. The letters I received, the handwriting was elegant, educated. The words were— He paused, searching for the right description. Flowery, full of poetry about nature and beauty and the romance of frontier life. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. Catherine has always had a way with words. She was the best student in our school before she finished. Can you write? The question was so unexpected that Martha blinked. Of course I can write. I don't mean copying out recipes. I mean actual writing, keeping accounts, corresponding with buyers, managing household records. Yes, Martha said firmly. I've kept the books for our farm since I was 16. I can read, write, cipher, and keep detailed records. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, though Martha couldn't quite identify what. He moved to the window, staring out at the dusty street beyond. I'm 34 years old, he said, his back to her. I came to this territory 12 years ago with nothing but a horse, a saddle, and enough money to file a homestead claim. I built my ranch from raw land. Every fence post, every building, every head of cattle represents work I did with my own hands. He turned to face her. It's not an easy life, Miss Lowell. The winters are brutal. We lose stock to wolves, weather, and disease. The nearest town is 8 miles from my ranch, and it's not much more than what you see here. There's no opera house, no social clubs, no afternoon teas or whatever it is proper ladies do back east. I'm from Nebraska, Mr. Turner, not Boston. A ghost of something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. Fair enough, but Nebraska has churches and schools and neighbors within shouting distance. My nearest neighbor is 3 miles away. The doctor is a day's ride. If something goes wrong, if you get sick or hurt or just desperately lonely, there's no easy help coming. I understand that. Do you? He crossed his arms, leaning against the window frame. Your sister's letters talked about the beauty of the mountains and the freedom of open spaces. She asked questions about wildflowers and whether we could have a garden. She never once asked about the reality of ranch life. Martha met his gaze steadily. I'm not my sister. No, Caleb agreed. You're not. Which brings me back to my question. Why did you agree to come? The honest answer stuck in Martha's throat, pride warring with the truth. But she'd promised herself no deception, and that meant swallowing her pride. Because I'm 23 years old with no prospects and a family in debt, she said quietly. Because 3 years of drought have nearly destroyed our farm, and the money you sent for passage was the only thing keeping us from complete ruin. Because my father made it clear that refusing wasn't an option. She paused, then added with more strength. But also because staying in that town for the rest of my life, watching it slowly die while I faded into a spinster taking care of other people's children, felt like a different kind of death. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. So you saw this as an escape? I saw it as a chance, Martha corrected. Maybe my only chance. But I won't take it under false pretenses, Mr. Turner. You deserve to know exactly what you're getting, or not getting. I'm not beautiful like Catherine. I'm not refined or delicate. I've worked on a farm my entire life, and it shows in my hands and my face. I can cook, clean, sew, preserve food, tend animals, and work from sunup to sundown without complaint. I'm healthy and strong, and I don't faint at the sight of blood or shy away from hard work. But I can't offer you the pretty bride you were expecting, and I won't pretend otherwise. The speech left her breathless, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd laid herself bare before this stranger, offering up her deficiencies and her strengths with equal honesty, and now there was nothing to do but wait for his verdict. Caleb was silent for so long that Martha began to calculate how much money she had for return passage. Not enough, probably. She'd have to wire her father for additional funds, which would deepen the shame and the debt. "Stand up," Caleb said suddenly. Martha rose, confused. He crossed the room until he stood directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He was examining her face with the same careful attention a man might give to a horse he was considering purchasing, and the comparison made her stiffen with indignation. "Mr. Turner, I'm not livestock to be inspected." "No," he agreed. "You're a woman asking to be my wife. That gives me the right to look at you properly." His eyes moved from her face to her hands, which she'd clenched at her sides. "Let me see." She understood what he wanted and reluctantly held out her hands, palms up. Caleb took them in his own, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he examined the work-roughened skin, the short nails, the old burn scar across her left thumb. "Farm work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He released her hands and stepped back. "Mrs. Hart mentioned you'd been traveling for 3 days." "Yes." "You must be exhausted." Martha blinked at the unexpected shift. "I'm tired, yes. When did you last eat a proper meal? I'm not sure that's relevant to—" "Answer the question." There was steel beneath the words, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Martha bristled but answered, "Yesterday morning." Caleb's expression darkened. "Yesterday morning. You've been on a stagecoach for over 24 hours with nothing but whatever hardtack and jerky they served at way stations." "I wasn't particularly hungry." "That's foolish. A person needs to eat, whether they're hungry or not." He moved toward the door. "Mrs. Hart, could you bring something for Miss Lowell? Whatever you have ready." "Already on it," came the cheerful reply from the kitchen. Caleb turned back to Martha. "Sit down before you fall down. You're swaying on your feet." Martha hadn't realized she was, but now that he mentioned it, the room did seem to tilt slightly. She sank back onto the sofa, pride warring with the undeniable truth that her legs felt like water. Mrs. Hart appeared with remarkable speed, carrying a tray laden with bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a large glass of milk. She set it on the small table beside the sofa and gave Martha an encouraging nod before retreating once more. "Eat," Caleb commanded. Martha wanted to refuse on principle. She didn't appreciate being ordered around like a child, but her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. With as much dignity as she could muster, she picked up a piece of bread and began to eat. Caleb watched for a moment, then seemed satisfied. He returned to his position by the window, giving her space. "Tell me about your farm work," he said. "Specifically." Martha swallowed a bite of cheese. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What were your responsibilities?" "Everything that needed doing. We had crops, wheat, corn, some vegetables. I worked the fields alongside my father and brothers during planting and harvest. I managed the kitchen garden, preserved food for winter, cooked for the family, cleaned, did laundry. We kept chickens, pigs, and 2 milk cows. I handled most of the animal care." "Can you shoot?" The question surprised her. "Yes, rifle and shotgun both. I'm a fair shot." "Ever butcher an animal?" "Chickens, pigs. Once helped with a steer." She met his eyes. "I told you, Mr. Turner, I don't shy away from blood." Can you ride? Yes, though we only had 2 horses and my brothers usually needed them. Deliver a calf? Twice, once successfully, once. She shook her head. We lost both the calf and the cow. He nodded as if this was a perfectly normal conversation for a man to have with a potential bride. Can you handle being alone? I mean truly alone, hours at a time with no one to talk to but yourself? Martha thought about the long afternoons in the fields, the early mornings milking cows while everyone else slept, the evenings she'd spent mending clothes by lamplight after everyone had gone to bed. Loneliness had been her constant companion for years. I'm familiar with solitude, she said quietly. Familiarity isn't the same as tolerance. I tolerate it fine. Caleb fell silent again, and Martha focused on eating, suddenly ravenous now that she'd started. The food was simple but good, and she could feel strength returning to her limbs with each bite. Finally, Caleb spoke. I'm going to tell you what I need in a wife, Miss Lowell. Not what I hoped for or dreamed about, what I actually need. Martha set down her glass and waited. I need someone who can manage a household in difficult conditions. Someone who won't fall apart when supplies run short or when I'm gone for days gathering stock. Someone who can cook for hired hands during branding and roundup, who can preserve enough food to last through a winter that might keep us snowbound for weeks. I need someone who can treat injuries, both human and animal, because the doctor is too far away to reach in emergencies. I need someone who can shoot straight enough to protect livestock from predators and accurate enough to bring down game if necessary. He paused. I need a partner, not a decoration. Someone strong enough to stand beside me when this territory tries to break us both. Each word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through Martha's understanding of what this man was offering. What I don't need, Caleb continued, his voice softening slightly, is someone who writes pretty letters about sunsets and wildflowers, but can't handle the reality of frontier life. Based on what you've told me, your sister would have been miserable within a month. Probably less, Martha admitted. So, in some ways, Miss Lowell, your father did me a favor by sending you instead. Hope flickered in Martha's chest, tentative and fragile. Does that mean... It means I'm not making a decision today. Caleb held up a hand as Martha started to protest. You've been traveling for 3 days. You're exhausted, probably still in shock from everything that's happened. I'm not going to ask you to commit to a life you haven't seen, and I'm not going to commit to a wife I've known for less than an hour. What are you proposing? A trial period, 2 weeks. Mrs. Hart can put you up here in town, or you can stay at the ranch in the spare room, your choice. During that time, you'll see what the life actually entails. You'll meet the hired hands, see the work, understand what you'd be taking on. And I'll have a chance to see if you're actually as capable as you claim. Martha's pride bristled at the implication that she might be lying about her abilities, but logic overrode emotion. He was being fair, perhaps more than fair. And at the end of 2 weeks? We both make a decision. If you want to go back, I'll arrange passage and enough money to make sure you're not destitute. If I decide it won't work, same thing, passage home with enough to start over. But if we both agree, he met her eyes steadily. Then we marry properly, with a preacher and witnesses, and a legal contract that protects us both. That seems reasonable, Martha admitted. It's practical, Caleb corrected. I learned years ago that practical beats romantic every time out here. Mrs. Hart appeared in the doorway, her timing so perfect that Martha suspected she'd been listening from the hallway. Have we reached an understanding? A temporary one, Caleb said. Miss Lowell will need a place to stay. Can you accommodate her? Of course, Mrs. Hart beamed. I have a lovely room upstairs that... Actually, Martha interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. If the offer stands, I'd prefer to stay at the ranch. Both Caleb and Mrs. Hart stared at her. Are you certain? Mrs. Hart asked carefully. It wouldn't be entirely proper. Even with a chaperone room, people might talk. Let them talk, Martha said. If I'm going to decide whether I can handle ranch life, I need to experience it, not observe it from 8 miles away. And you said yourself there would be hired hands there. That's chaperone enough by frontier standards. Caleb's eyebrow rose slightly. You understand this means hard work starting immediately? I won't treat you like a guest. I don't want to be treated like a guest. I want to know what I'm actually agreeing to. For the first time since Martha had arrived, Caleb Turner smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a quirk at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his severe features into something almost approachable. All right then, we'll head out this afternoon. It's a 2-hour ride, which will get us there before dark. He looked at Mrs. Hart. Can you help Miss Lowell get ready? She'll need practical clothes if she has them. The only clothes I have are practical, Martha said dryly. That earned her another almost smile. Good. Meet me at the livery in an hour. I'll get us a wagon for your trunk. He tipped his hat to both women and strode out, leaving Martha and Mrs. Hart alone in the parlor. The older woman immediately grabbed Martha's hands, her face alight with barely contained excitement. Oh, my dear, I think that went remarkably well. He's testing me, Martha said, making sure I'm not completely useless before he commits. He's being cautious, which is wise. But Martha, did you see the way he looked at you when you said you'd stay at the ranch? That was respect. Caleb Turner doesn't respect many people. Martha wasn't sure she'd seen anything of the sort, but Mrs. Hart's enthusiasm was impossible to resist entirely. Come on, the older woman continued, pulling Martha toward the stairs. Let's get you freshened up and into something suitable for riding. I have some split skirts that might fit you, much more practical than trying to manage a wagon in that traveling dress. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Martha washed away 3 days of road dust, changed into borrowed clothes that fit reasonably well, and repacked her trunk with Mrs. Hart's help. The older woman kept up a steady stream of information about the territory, the ranch, and Caleb himself. He came here with nothing, you know. Just a young man who'd lost his family back in Missouri. Fever took them all in one terrible winter. He filed a homestead claim and built that ranch through sheer stubbornness and hard work. Had some setbacks, lost his first herd to a blizzard, nearly lost the ranch to drought 2 years running, but he held on when stronger men gave up and left. Is he always so... Martha searched for the right word. Stern? He's serious, yes. Life out here makes you that way. But he's fair, and his word is gold. If he tells you something, you can trust it absolutely. Mrs. Hart pinned up Martha's hair in a more practical style. And he's lonely, though he'd never admit it. A man like that needs someone to build with, to share the burden. Your sister might have been pretty, but pretty fades fast under this sun. What Caleb needs is exactly what you are, strong, capable, and honest. Martha wanted to believe her, but years of being the overlooked sister had taught her not to hope for too much. When they arrived at the livery, they found Caleb waiting with a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 solid-looking horses. Martha's trunk was already loaded in the back, along with several crates of supplies. Made a few purchases while I was in town, Caleb explained, helping Martha up onto the wagon seat. No sense making 2 trips. Mrs. Hart handed up a large basket. Some food for your journey and a few things for the larder. Martha, dear, you come to see me if you need anything at all. And Caleb Turner, you treat this girl right or you'll answer to me. Yes, ma'am, Caleb said with what might have been amusement. He climbed up beside Martha, released the brake, and clicked to the horses. The wagon lurched into motion, wheels crunching on the hard-packed dirt. Martha looked back once to see Mrs. Hart waving from the street, and then they rounded a corner and the town disappeared behind them. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably as they left Clearwater Ridge behind. The road, more of a track really, wound through rolling grassland dotted with sage and wildflowers. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks sharp against the brilliant blue sky. It's beautiful, Martha said quietly. It's harsh, Caleb corrected. Beautiful, yes, but it'll kill you if you're not careful. Those mountains bring blizzards that can bury you in minutes. That grass dries out by August and becomes tinder waiting for lightning. Those pretty streams flood every spring and can sweep away anything in their path. You sound like you're trying to scare me away. I'm trying to make sure you understand what you're committing to. He kept his eyes on the road. Romance and reality are very different things out here. I'm not looking for romance, Mr. Turner. I'm looking for a life. He glanced at her then, really looked at her, and Martha felt something shift in his expression. What are you running from, Miss Lowell? The question caught her off guard. I'm not running from anything. Everyone who comes west is running from something. Bad debts, bad decisions, bad luck. What's yours? Martha considered lying, then remembered her promise to herself. Invisibility. Caleb's brow furrowed. Explain. I spent 23 years being the responsible one, the capable one, the one everyone depended on, but no one actually saw. I was useful, but I wasn't valued. Not really. Catherine was the one people noticed, the one they praised and protected. I was just Martha, steady and boring and useful. She stared out at the passing landscape. I suppose I'm running from a life where I'd always be in someone's shadow, always be the second choice, always be just there. And you think being a rancher's wife in the middle of nowhere will make you visible? I think it will make me essential. There's a difference between being needed because you're convenient and being needed because without you, everything falls apart. She met his eyes. You said you needed a partner, not a decoration. Maybe I need the same thing, to be someone's partner instead of their afterthought. Caleb was quiet for several long moments. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. My wife won't be an afterthought, Miss Lowell. She'll be the difference between success and failure, but that also means the weight will be on her shoulders as much as mine. It's not an easy burden. I've carried burdens before. Not like this. Then I'll learn. He nodded slowly, and they fell back into silence, but it felt different now, less awkward, more companionable. The sun was lowering toward the mountains when they crested a ridge, and Caleb pulled the horses to a stop. There, he said, pointing. Martha followed his gesture and drew in a sharp breath. The ranch spread across a valley cradled between protective ridges. A house stood at the center, not large but solid, built of logs with a stone chimney that spoke of warmth and permanence. Nearby stood a barn, several smaller outbuildings, and an extensive network of corrals. Cattle dotted the meadows beyond, dark shapes against the golden grass. A creek wound through the property, catching the late afternoon sun and throwing back shards of light. It wasn't grand or imposing, but it was real and substantial, a place carved out of wilderness through determination and sweat. How many acres? Martha asked. 2,000 deeded. Another 1,000 I use with government permission for summer grazing. Running about 300 head right now, hoping to increase that if we can manage the winter feed. Water rights. He looked at her with renewed interest. Creek runs through my property year-round, plus 2 good springs in the high pastures. Why? Water rights make or break a ranch, Martha said. We learned that in Nebraska the hard way. Your father teach you that? My grandfather, before he died, he said land without water is just expensive dirt. Caleb made a sound that might have been approval. Your grandfather was a smart man. Come on, let's get you settled before dark. They descended into the valley, and as they drew closer, Martha could make out more details. The house had a covered porch running along the front, and someone had attempted a small garden beside it, though it looked neglected. The barn was in good repair, as were the fences. Everything spoke of a man who maintained his property, but lacked the time or help to make it truly thrive. 2 men emerged from the barn as they approached. Both were weathered and lean, dressed in the practical clothing of working cowboys. That's Jake and Tom, Caleb said. They've been with me for 3 years. Good men, hard workers. They bunk in the cabin behind the barn. He pulled the wagon up in front of the house and climbed down, then reached up to help Martha. His hands spanned her waist easily, and he lifted her down as if she weighed nothing. For just a moment, they stood close enough that Martha could see flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes, and then he stepped back, the moment broken. Jake, Tom, this is Miss Martha Lowell. She'll be staying for a while. The 2 hired hands touched their hat brims respectfully, their faces carefully neutral. Martha wondered what Caleb had told them, if anything, about her situation. Ma'am, they said in unison. Miss Lowell will need her trunk brought inside, Caleb continued. Tom, after that, can you help me unload these supplies? Yes, boss. Caleb turned to Martha. Come on, I'll show you the house. He led her up the porch steps and through a solid wooden door into a main room that served as both kitchen and living area. It was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that was sturdy, if not elegant. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and windows on either side let in the last of the afternoon light. Kitchen's through there, Caleb pointed to an alcove that held a cast-iron stove, shelves of dishes, and a work table. Pantry's behind that door. My room's on the far side, spare rooms here. He opened a door to reveal a small bedroom with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a single window overlooking the side yard. It was plain, almost austere, but it was clean, and the bed looked comfortable. "Washroom's out back," Caleb continued. "There's a pump in the kitchen for water. We heat it on the stove for washing. Privy's behind the woodshed. I know it's not ideal, but that's how it is." "It's fine," Martha said. And she meant it. She'd expected something rougher, more primitive. Jake appeared with her trunk, setting it carefully at the foot of the bed. "Anything else, boss?" "No, that's good. Thanks, Jake." When they were alone again, Caleb moved to the kitchen and lit a lamp against the gathering dusk. "I usually make do with simple meals, beans, bacon, bread. There's supplies in the pantry if you want to make something more complicated." Martha set her bag on the bed and joined him in the kitchen. "I'll cook dinner tonight. It's the least I can do." "You don't have to." "I want to. Consider it the start of my trial period." Caleb studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll be outside helping with evening chores. We eat around sunset." He left, and Martha stood alone in the quiet house, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a working ranch settling in for the evening. Through the window, she could see Caleb walking toward the barn, his stride confident and purposeful. She'd done it. She'd traveled across territory and frontier, confessed her deception, and somehow landed not rejection, but a chance. 2 weeks to prove herself, to show she was worth keeping. Martha rolled up her sleeves and turned to examine the pantry. It was well stocked with basics but lacking variety or imagination, exactly what she'd expect from a man cooking only for himself. She could work with this. As the sun set behind the mountains and darkness crept across the valley, Martha Lowell began her first meal in what might become her home, her hands steady and her heart full of cautious, fragile hope. The biscuits came out golden and perfect, steam rising from their split centers as Martha set them on the table alongside fried salt pork, beans seasoned with molasses, and a touch of mustard she'd found in the pantry, and gravy made from the pan drippings. It wasn't fancy, but it was substantial and hot, the kind of meal that stuck to a man's ribs after a long day of physical labor. Caleb came in just as she was pouring coffee, Jake and Tom following behind him. All three men stopped short at the sight of the laden table, and Martha saw surprise flicker across their faces. "Didn't expect all this," Caleb said quietly. "You said you usually ate simple. I thought you might appreciate something with a little more effort." Martha gestured to the table. "Sit, please, before it gets cold." The men exchanged glances, then removed their hats and took their seats. Martha served them, her movements efficient and practiced, before filling her own plate and sitting at the remaining chair. Caleb said a brief grace, his voice rough but sincere, and then they ate. The silence was broken only by the clink of utensils and the occasional murmur of appreciation. Martha watched from beneath her lashes as Jake reached for a third biscuit, as Tom scraped his plate clean and looked longingly at the pan, as Caleb ate steadily and methodically, his expression unreadable. "These biscuits," Tom said finally, breaking the silence with obvious effort, "are about the best thing I've eaten since my ma's cooking back in Kansas." Jake nodded agreement, his mouth too full to speak. Caleb set down his fork and looked at Martha directly. "You weren't exaggerating about your cooking skills." "I told you I don't lie, Mr. Turner." "Caleb," he corrected, "if you're staying here, even temporarily, we can dispense with the formality." "Then you should call me Martha." He nodded slowly. "Martha it is." After dinner, the hired hands excused themselves, Jake slapping Tom on the back as they headed toward their cabin, their voices carrying in the quiet evening air. Martha cleared the table and heated water for washing up, falling into the familiar rhythm of kitchen work. She was aware of Caleb moving around the main room, feeding the fire in the hearth, adjusting the damper on the stove, doing the small tasks of a man settling in for the evening. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said, watching her scrub the plates. "You've been traveling for days. Dishes don't clean themselves, and I'd rather start tomorrow with a fresh kitchen." Martha dried the last plate and stacked it on the shelf. "Besides, I'm used to working tired." "I can see that." He moved to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. "We start early here. I'll wake you at dawn." "I'm usually up before dawn." He turned to look at her, and something in his expression had shifted, become less guarded. "You meant it, didn't you? When you said you wanted to experience the real work, not just observe it." "Every word." "Then tomorrow you'll get your wish. We're moving cattle to the upper pasture. It's a full day's work, Hard riding, harder walking, and no guarantees everything will go smoothly. Martha met his gaze steadily. I'll be ready. We'll see. She expected him to say goodnight then, to retreat to his own room and leave her to settle in alone. Instead, he crossed to a shelf near the fireplace and pulled down a worn leather journal, bringing it to the table where the lamplight was strongest. These are the ranch accounts, he said, opening the book to reveal pages of careful numbers and notes. Cattle inventory, breeding records, expenses, income from stock sales. I keep everything documented. He looked at her carefully. You said you kept books for your family farm. Can you make sense of this? Martha pulled the journal closer and studied the entries. His handwriting was surprisingly neat, the numbers aligned in precise columns, the notes detailed and thorough. She could see immediately that he was meticulous, tracking not just major transactions but small expenses, noting weather patterns, recording births and deaths in his herd. Your system is clear and well organized, she said, better than many farmers I've known. You track things most ranchers wouldn't bother with. Knowledge is the difference between profit and loss. I need to know which bulls produce the strongest calves, which pastures support the most growth, what seasons bring the most risk. Pointed to a series of entries from the previous winter. See here, I lost 40 head in that blizzard. But because I kept detailed records, I knew exactly which bloodlines survived best, which animals were worth the extra effort to save. Martha traced her finger down the columns, doing quick calculations in her head. You've grown the herd by almost 30% in 3 years. He looked surprised. You can see that just from looking at the numbers? It's basic mathematics. You started with 230 head. You're now running just over 300, accounting for losses and sales. She looked up at him. That's impressive growth for a ranch this size. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a wall coming down by inches. Most women I've met couldn't tell a profit from a loss if it was written in front of them. Then you've been meeting the wrong women. Martha closed the journal carefully. My father thinks numbers are men's business, but my grandfather taught me different. He said money doesn't care who counts it, as long as it's counted right. I think I would have liked your grandfather. He would have liked you too. He respected men who built things. Caleb took the journal back, but his fingers lingered on the worn leather cover. If you stay, this will be part of your responsibility. Not just the house and the cooking, but the accounts, the planning. I need a partner who understands the business side of ranching. I can do that. I believe you can. He returned the journal to its shelf. Get some rest, Martha. Tomorrow we'll test that belief. He disappeared into his room, and Martha prepared for bed in the small spare room, unpacking only what she needed for the night. Through the thin walls, she could hear the subtle sounds of Caleb moving around, the creak of bed springs as he settled in, and then silence. Martha lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch at night. Cattle lowing in the distance, the wind sighing through the eaves, an owl calling from somewhere in the darkness. It was so different from the close, crowded farmhouse she'd left behind, where every sound was familiar and every space was claimed. Here, she had a room to herself. Here, she had space to breathe. She woke before dawn to the sound of Caleb moving in the kitchen, building up the fire. Martha dressed quickly in the split skirt Mrs. Hart had given her and a sturdy work shirt, braiding her hair in a tight plait that would stay secure through a day of hard work. When she emerged from her room, she found Caleb already dressed and booted, coffee brewing on the stove. "Morning," he said, handing her a cup. "Can you ride astride, or do you need a side saddle?" "I can ride astride. It's more practical." "Good. We've got a mare that should suit you. Steady temperament, sure-footed in rough country." He gulped his coffee, barely seeming to notice the heat. "We'll eat a quick breakfast and head out. The cattle have been grazing the lower pasture all spring, and it's time to move them up where the grass is still fresh." Martha fried eggs and more salt pork, toasted yesterday's leftover biscuits, and they ate standing up, efficient and quick. Jake and Tom appeared just as they were finishing, looking surprised to find breakfast already prepared. "Miss Martha's coming with us today," Caleb announced. "She'll be riding Dancer." If the hired hands had opinions about this, they kept them to themselves, though Martha caught Jake and Tom exchanging quick glances. At the barn, Caleb led out a compact bay mare with kind eyes and a white blaze down her face. This is Dancer. She's not fancy, but she won't spook easy, and she's got endurance. Martha ran her hand down the mare's neck, letting the horse get her scent. Hello, beautiful girl. Caleb handed her a saddle. Let's see how you handle tacking up. Martha hoisted the saddle with practiced ease, settling it on Dancer's back and reaching under for the girth. She tightened it properly, checked the stirrups, and adjusted the bridle, all while Caleb watched with an expression she couldn't quite read. Your brothers taught you well, he said. My grandfather, actually. He said a woman who couldn't saddle her own horse couldn't call herself a rider. Smart man. They mounted up and Martha settled into the saddle with relief. It had been months since she'd ridden. The horses back home were needed for field work, but her body remembered the rhythm, the balance, the feel of a horse moving beneath her. Caleb led them out at a steady trot, heading toward the lower pasture where the cattle were scattered across several acres. The sun was just breaking over the eastern ridge, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. We'll spread out, Caleb instructed. Push them gently toward the north trail. Don't rush them. Stressed cattle lose weight, and we can't afford that. Jake, you take the west flank. Tom, east. Martha, you're with me in the middle. They separated, and Martha found herself riding alongside Caleb as they approached the grazing herd. The cattle looked up with mild interest as the riders approached, then slowly began moving away from the horses. Easy now, Caleb called. Let them set the pace. It was slow, patient work. Every time a cow tried to break away from the group, one of the riders would move to turn it back. The cattle were used to being moved and didn't fight much, but there were always a few stubborn individuals who decided they'd rather stay where they were. Martha spotted a young heifer breaking from the group and automatically moved to intercept, Dancer responding to her subtle cues with smooth precision. The heifer tried to dodge past them, but Martha anticipated the move and cut her off, turning her back toward the main group. Nice work, Caleb called, and Martha felt a flush of pride. They worked through the morning, pushing the cattle gradually toward the narrow trail that led up into the higher country. The sun climbed higher, and Martha felt sweat trickling down her back despite the relatively cool mountain air. Her legs were starting to ache from hours in the saddle, and her shoulders were tight from the constant small adjustments required to keep her position. But she didn't complain, didn't ask for a break, just kept riding, kept watching, kept working. Around midday, they stopped to let the cattle graze and rest. Caleb dismounted near a small stream, and Martha followed suit, wincing slightly as her stiff legs protested. You holding up? Caleb asked, handing her a canteen. I'm fine. You're limping. I'll walk it off. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. We're about halfway. Another few hours and we'll have them settled in the upper pasture. Tom appeared, leading his horse to the stream. That heifer you turned earlier, the roan one, she's got a bad limp on her front left. Want me to check it? I'll look at it, Caleb said. Martha, come with me. You should know how to spot trouble in the herd. They walked through the resting cattle, Caleb pointing out various individuals and explaining their history, their breeding, their quirks. He knew every animal, could identify them at a glance, remembered which ones were prone to illness and which ones were reliable breeders. They found the limping heifer near the edge of the group. Caleb approached her slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice, and the animal allowed him to get close enough to examine her leg. Caught something in her hoof, he said. Stone, probably. Martha, can you hold her head while I get it out? Martha moved to the heifer's shoulder, gripping the halter firmly while Caleb lifted the injured hoof and used a hoof pick to dislodge a wedged stone. The heifer shifted nervously, but didn't bolt. Good, Caleb said, releasing the hoof and running his hand down the leg one more time. Should be fine now. Keep an eye on her, though. Make sure she's not favoring it later. I will. They returned to their horses, and Caleb pulled out some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, offering half to Martha. They ate standing up, watching the cattle and the play of light across the mountains. You're not what I expected, Caleb said suddenly. Martha swallowed her bite of jerky. In what way? You don't complain. Don't make excuses. You just do what needs doing. He looked at her directly. I've known men who couldn't keep up the pace you're setting. Is this another test? Everything is a test out here, Martha. The land tests you, the weather tests you, the work tests you every single day. He shifted his weight, his expression serious. But I'm not testing whether you can survive. I'm testing whether you want to. I want to, she said firmly. I told you, I'm looking for a life, not an escape. Life here isn't easy. Nothing worth having ever is. He held her gaze for a long moment, and Martha felt something shift between them, some invisible barrier beginning to crack. Then Jake called out that the cattle were getting restless, and the moment broke. They mounted up and continued pushing the herd higher. The trail grew steeper, rockier, and the cattle moved more slowly, picking their way carefully over the rough ground. Martha's thighs burned from gripping the saddle, and her hands were starting to blister despite years of work-hardened skin. But she gritted her teeth and kept riding. They reached the upper pasture in late afternoon, and Caleb gave a satisfied nod as the cattle spread out across the fresh grass. This should hold them through summer. We'll check on them every few days, make sure none have wandered too far. The ride back to the ranch house was quieter, all 4 riders tired from the long day. Martha's entire body ached, and she was fairly certain she'd have bruises tomorrow from places she didn't know could bruise. But she'd done it. She'd worked a full day alongside experienced ranchers and held her own. As they approached the barn, Caleb pulled up alongside her. You did good work today. Thank you. No need for thanks. I'm just stating fact. He dismounted and moved to help her down, and Martha was grateful for the assistance since her legs felt like rubber. His hand steadied her until she found her footing. Go on inside and rest, he said. We'll handle the horses. I should help. You've done enough for today. Go. Martha wanted to argue, but her body overruled her pride. She nodded and walked stiffly toward the house, every step a reminder of muscles pushed past their limits. Inside, she pumped water and heated it for washing, sponging away the day's sweat and dust with a cloth. Then she started dinner preparations, refusing to let exhaustion stop her from fulfilling what she saw as her responsibilities. When the men came in an hour later, they found the table set and a pot of stew simmering on the stove, rich with beef and vegetables. You didn't have to cook, Caleb said. Not after the day you've had. Someone has to feed us, Martha replied. Might as well be me. They ate with the same efficient silence as the night before, but Martha noticed Tom and Jake seemed more relaxed around her now, less uncertain about her presence. They were testing her too, she realized, watching to see if she'd last or if she'd fold under the pressure. She intended to prove them all wrong. The next morning brought new challenges. Caleb announced they'd be branding calves born late in the spring, work that required strength, speed, and a strong stomach. Ever brand before? He asked Martha over breakfast. No, but I've watched it done. Watching and doing are different things. You might want to sit this one out. Martha set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. I didn't come here to sit things out, Caleb. His mouth twitched. Fair enough. The branding pen was set up near the barn, a solid corral with a fire pit already built, and irons heating in the coals. Jake and Tom worked with practiced efficiency, separating calves from their mothers and guiding them toward the pen while the anxious cows bellowed their protests. Your job, Caleb told Martha, is to keep track of the count and make notes in the journal about each calf, sex, approximate weight, any distinguishing marks or health concerns. Can you handle that? Yes. He handed her the journal and a pencil. Stay by the fence. Don't get in the pen unless I tell you to. Martha positioned herself where she could see the entire operation. The first calf was herded into the pen, and Tom roped it with casual expertise, throwing the loop around its hind legs and pulling it off balance. Jake grabbed the calf and wrestled it to the ground, holding it steady while Caleb approached with the hot iron. The smell of burning hair and flesh hit Martha's nostrils, acrid and unpleasant, but she kept her expression neutral and made her notes. Male calf, approximately 80 pounds, healthy. They worked through the morning, one calf after another. Martha documented each one, her handwriting remaining steady, even as the sounds of frightened calves and bellowing mothers filled the air. It was hard, brutal work, and she could see the toll it took on the men, sweat streaming down their faces, muscles straining, movements growing gradually slower as exhaustion set in. Around mid-morning, a larger calf proved particularly difficult. It fought against the rope, kicking violently, and Jake struggled to control it. "Little help here, help," he called. Martha set down the journal and climbed into the pen without hesitation, moving to the calf's head and gripping it firmly, using her body weight to help hold the animal still. The calf bucked and twisted, nearly throwing her off, but she held on grimly until Caleb finished the branding. "Let him go!" Caleb called, and they released the calf simultaneously, scrambling back as it surged to its feet and bolted toward its mother. Martha's shirt was torn. She had a scrape on her forearm, and she was breathing hard. But she'd done it. "I told you to stay by the fence," Caleb said, but there was no anger in his voice. "You needed help. That calf could have kicked you in the head." "But it didn't," Jake laughed, a short bark of surprised approval. "She's tougher than she looks, boss." "I'm beginning to see that," Caleb said quietly, his eyes on Martha. They finished the branding by early afternoon, and Caleb declared the rest of the day free for everyone to recover. Martha returned to the house, changed her torn shirt, and tended to her scrape before starting on the mountain of laundry that had accumulated. She was hanging sheets on the line behind the house when Caleb found her. "You don't have to do that today," he said. "The sheets need washing regardless of whether I'm tired." Martha pinned another corner, the fabric snapping in the wind. "Besides, I find the work soothing." Most women would call it drudgery. Most women probably have other options. He leaned against the porch post, watching her work. "You keep saying things like that, like you believe you don't deserve better than drudgery." Martha paused, a sheet half hung. "I don't think it's about deserving. It's about accepting reality. I'm plain, I'm past my prime by most standards, and I'm from a family with nothing to offer. Those are facts, not complaints. You're 23, not ancient. Tell that to the men who passed me over for prettier girls." "Then they were fools." The words hung in the air between them. Martha turned to look at him fully, uncertain she'd heard correctly. Caleb pushed away from the post, suddenly seeming uncomfortable. "I just mean, you have more value than you give yourself credit for. Skills matter more than appearance in the long run." "Is that what you're looking for? Skills?" "I'm looking for someone who won't break," he said bluntly. "Someone who can stand beside me when everything goes to hell, which it will, repeatedly. Someone who will fight for what we're building instead of running at the first hardship." He met her eyes steadily. "So far, you're exceeding every expectation I had." Pride bloomed warm in Martha's chest, more intoxicating than any compliment on her appearance could have been. This man saw her capability, her strength, her determination, saw her, not just what she could do for him. "The 2 weeks aren't up yet," she said softly. "You might change your mind. Or you might change yours." "I won't. We'll see." But there was something in his expression that suggested he believed her, and that belief felt like the most precious gift anyone had ever given her. The days fell into a rhythm. Martha woke before dawn, prepared breakfast, worked alongside Caleb and the hired hands on whatever task the ranch demanded. She learned to doctor sick cattle, to mend fence, to judge the quality of hay and calculate how much they'd need for winter. She kept the house running smoothly, the books updated, the men fed and the clothes clean. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Caleb began to relax around her. He still didn't speak much. That seemed to be his nature. But the silence between them grew comfortable. He started asking her opinion on ranch decisions, listening carefully to her answers, and sometimes even taking her suggestions. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and he'd tell her stories about the territory, about the years he'd spent building the ranch from nothing. "First winter here nearly killed me," he said one evening, his voice quiet in the gathering dark. "Blizzard came early, caught me unprepared. Lost my first string of horses, nearly froze to death in my own barn. Couldn't feel my feet for 3 days. But you stayed. Didn't have anywhere else to go. This was my last chance. If I failed here, that was it." He looked at her. "You understand that, don't you? The feeling of this being your last chance?" "Yes," Martha said. "I understand it completely." On the 10th day, the storm hit. It started with a change in the wind, a heaviness in the air that made the horses nervous and the cattle restless. Caleb studied the sky with a grim expression. "Storm coming," he announced at breakfast. "Big one by the look of it. We need to get everything secured." They spent the morning in frantic preparation, bringing horses into the barn, checking that all the outbuildings were secure, moving vulnerable equipment under cover. The wind picked up steadily, and by noon the first drops of rain were falling. "Get inside," Caleb told Martha. "This is going to be bad." "What about the cattle in the upper pasture?" His jaw tightened. "They'll have to ride it out. Nothing we can do for them now." But as the afternoon wore on and the storm intensified into a howling fury of wind and rain, Caleb grew increasingly agitated. He paced the house like a caged animal, stopping periodically to stare out the window at the deluge. 20 head up there are first-time mothers," he said finally. "Young heifers that have never been through a storm like this. If they panic, they'll scatter. We could lose half of them." "Then we go get them," Martha said. "Are you insane? It's a 2-hour ride in good weather. In this, it's a 3-hour ride and it's dangerous." "I know. But you can't afford to lose 20 head, Caleb. Not and still make it through next winter." He stared at her, and she saw the war playing out in his expression, the practical rancher weighing risks against rewards, the decent man unwilling to put someone else in danger. "I'll go alone," he said finally. "No, you won't. You'll need help moving frightened cattle, and you know it. I'm going with you." "Martha, don't waste time arguing. Every minute we delay makes it worse." For a moment she thought he'd refuse, would order her to stay behind. Then he grabbed 2 oilcloth slickers from a hook by the door. "Put this on, and Martha." He waited until she looked at him. "Stay close to me. No matter what happens, you stay where I can see you." They rode out into the teeth of the storm, rain lashing their faces and wind trying to tear them from their saddles. Dancer fought the bit, terrified, but Martha held her firm and kept her moving forward. Beside her, Caleb rode with grim determination, his eyes scanning the landscape for landmarks that the storm was doing its best to obscure. The ride up to the upper pasture was a nightmare of slick rocks and driving rain. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the valley in stark flashes of white light, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Martha's hands were numb on the reins, her clothes soaked through despite the slicker, her entire body shaking from cold and fear and adrenaline. But she didn't fall back, didn't ask to turn around, just kept riding, following Caleb's dark shape through the storm. They found the cattle scattered and panicked exactly as Caleb had predicted. The young mothers were running in circles, separated from their calves, while the bulls stood with their backs to the wind, stubbornly refusing to move. "We have to push them down together," Caleb shouted over the roar of the storm. "Otherwise they'll scatter worse." It was impossible work. Every time they got a group moving in the right direction, lightning would flash and the cattle would bolt. Martha's voice was raw from shouting, her body battered from controlling a terrified horse, her vision blurred by rain and exhaustion. But gradually, impossibly, they began to make progress. The cattle were tired too, and eventually fear gave way to the stronger instinct to find shelter. They started moving down the trail, pushed by 2 stubborn riders who refused to give up. Halfway down, disaster struck. A bolt of lightning hit a tree barely 50 yards away, the crack so loud it felt like the world was splitting open. Dancer reared in pure terror, and Martha felt herself sliding, her numb fingers losing their grip on the reins. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Through the rain and confusion, she saw Dancer bolting down the trail, reins trailing. She tried to get up, but her ankle screamed in protest, and she went down again. Then Caleb was there, dismounting in one fluid motion and crouching beside her. "Are you hurt?" he had to shout to be heard over the storm. "My ankle. I think I twisted it." He didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion, he lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. His arm came around her waist, holding her secure against his chest. "Hold on to me," he commanded. "Don't let go for anything." They rode down double, Caleb controlling the horse with one hand while keeping Martha secure with the other. She pressed back against his solid warmth, using his strength to stay upright as pain radiated from her injured ankle and exhaustion threatened to drag her under. The cattle, mercifully, seemed to have found their own way down. By the time they reached the lower pasture, the herd had settled into the shelter of a grove of trees, still frightened but no longer scattering. "They'll be all right here," Caleb said. "Let's get you home." The ride back to the ranch house was a blur of pain and cold in the steady drum of rain. Martha drifted in and out of awareness, held secure by Caleb's arm and the rhythm of the horse beneath them. At some point, she realized she'd turned her face into his chest, seeking any warmth she could find, and she couldn't bring herself to care about propriety or independence anymore. They reached the house as the storm began to ease. Caleb dismounted and lifted Martha down with infinite care, then carried her up the porch steps and into the house without asking if she could walk. He set her on a chair near the fireplace and immediately began building up the fire. "Get out of those wet clothes," he said. "You're going to catch pneumonia." Martha's fingers fumbled uselessly at the buttons of her shirt. They were too numb, too clumsy. After watching her struggle for a moment, Caleb swore under his breath and crossed to help her, his own cold fingers working the buttons with surprising deftness. "Arms up," he said, and when she obeyed, he pulled the wet shirt off, leaving her in her chemise. He grabbed a blanket from his room and wrapped it around her shoulders, then knelt to examine her ankle. Martha hissed as he carefully removed her boot and probed the swollen flesh. "It's not broken," he said. "Bad sprain, though. You'll be off it for a few days." "I can't. There's too much work." "The work will keep. Right now, you need to warm up and rest." He disappeared into his room and returned with dry clothes, one of his shirts and some wool socks. "Put these on. I'll make something hot to drink." Martha changed awkwardly under the blanket, her shaking hands making simple tasks complicated. By the time she'd managed it, Caleb had strong coffee brewing and was heating water for tea with something that smelled like honey and whiskey. He pressed the cup into her hands. "Drink all of it." The liquid burned going down, but warmth began to spread through her chest. She could feel her body starting to respond, to thaw, and with the thaw came pain, her ankle throbbing, her muscles screaming, a dozen new bruises making themselves known. Caleb changed his own clothes and then sat across from her, his expression troubled. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever done," he said quietly, "taking you out in that storm. You could have been killed. But I wasn't, and we saved the cattle." "To hell with the cattle. I almost got you killed over some frightened cows." Martha set down her cup. "Caleb, I made the choice to go. You tried to stop me." "I should have tried harder. And if you had, we'd have lost 20 head. You can't afford that loss." He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his shoulders tight with tension. "You don't understand. When I saw you fall, when I thought—" He stopped, the words choking off. Martha's heart began to pound for reasons that had nothing to do with the storm or the ride. "When you thought what?" "When I thought I might lose you." He turned to face her, and the raw emotion in his expression took her breath away. "In that moment, I realized that losing the cattle, losing the whole damn ranch, would have been nothing compared to losing you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither of them had expected. Martha stared at him, scarcely daring to believe what she was hearing. "Caleb, I know it's only been 10 days. I know this was supposed to be a trial period, a practical arrangement. But Martha, somewhere in the last week and a half, this stopped being about finding a capable ranch wife." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his. "I don't want you to stay because it's practical. I want you to stay because I can't imagine this place without you in it. I want you to stay because when I think about the future, you're in every version of it I can see." Martha felt tears pricking at her eyes, hot against her cold cheeks. "I'm not beautiful, Caleb. I'm not refined or graceful or any of the things men usually want." "You're strong," he said fiercely. "You're honest and capable and brave enough to ride into a storm because it was the right thing to do. You're exactly what I want, Martha Lowell. The question is, am I what you want?" Martha thought about the man who'd given her honesty from the first moment, who'd tested her and trusted her, and valued her for exactly who she was. She thought about the life they could build together, hard and demanding, but theirs, built on partnership and respect. "Yes," she whispered, "you're exactly what I want." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "Then marry me. Not in 2 weeks. Not after some arbitrary trial period. Marry me as soon as we can get the preacher here, and let's build this life together." "Yes," Martha said again, and then she was laughing and crying at once, and Caleb was pulling her into his arms, careful of her injured ankle, holding her like she was something precious instead of practical. Outside, the storm was breaking, the rain easing to a gentle patter. Inside, by the warm fire in a solid house built by determined hands, two people who thought they were settling for practicality discovered they'd found something infinitely more valuable. They'd found each other. They were married 3 days later in the small church at Clearwater Ridge, With Mrs. Hart weeping joyfully in the front pew and Jake and Tom standing as witnesses, their weathered faces split with genuine smiles. Martha wore a simple dress of deep blue calico that Mrs. Hart had helped her sew in frantic late-night sessions, her hair braided with wildflowers that Caleb had picked that morning from the meadow behind the house. The ceremony was brief, the preacher's words carrying weight despite their simplicity. When Caleb slipped a plain gold band onto Martha's finger, his mother's ring, he'd told her quietly, the only thing he had left of his family, she felt the significance of it settle around her heart like an anchor finally finding solid ground. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, and Caleb kissed her with a tenderness that made Martha's knees weak, his hands framing her face like she was something infinitely precious. The small gathering afterward at Mrs. Hart's house was cheerful and warm, the older woman having prepared a feast that seemed impossible for one person to have created. Neighbors Martha had barely met came to offer congratulations and curious glances, clearly wondering about the hasty wedding and the bride who'd appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "Heard you rode out in that storm last week," one grizzled rancher named Cooper said, studying Martha with sharp eyes. "Helped Caleb save his breeding stock." "We both worked to bring them down," Martha replied carefully. "Most women would have stayed inside where it was safe." "Most women aren't marrying ranchers who need partners, not decorations." Cooper's weathered face creased into a grin. "Reckon Caleb got himself a good one then. About time that boy had some luck." The celebration lasted until early evening, and then Caleb helped Martha into the wagon for the ride back to the ranch. Back to their home, Martha reminded herself, still adjusting to the reality of it. Her ankle had healed enough to walk with only a slight limp, though Caleb still watched her carefully, ready to offer support at the slightest sign of pain. The sun was setting as they crested the ridge overlooking the valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Caleb pulled the horses to a stop, the same place he'd first shown her the ranch. "Do you remember standing here 2 weeks ago?" he asked quietly, "when you were preparing to tell me the truth about why you'd come?" "I was terrified," Martha admitted. "I thought you'd send me away immediately." "I almost did." He turned to look at her, his blue-gray eyes serious. "I was angry at first, at your father for the deception, at your sister for running, at the whole situation. But then you started talking, and I realized something." "What?" "That sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances. If Catherine had come, if everything had gone according to the original plan, I would have married a woman who didn't want to be here, who would have resented every hard day and every sacrifice. Instead, I got you." He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I got someone who chose this life, who wanted it enough to risk everything for it." Martha squeezed his hand, overwhelmed by emotions she didn't quite have words for. "I was the one who got lucky, Caleb. You could have refused me, sent me back in shame. Instead, you gave me a chance to prove myself." "You proved yourself in the first hour, Martha. Everything after that was just me being too stubborn to admit I'd already made my choice." He clicked to the horses, and they descended into the valley as husband and wife, the ranch spreading before them in the golden light. The first weeks of marriage settled into a pattern of hard work and quiet contentment. Martha threw herself into making the house truly theirs, scrubbing every corner, organizing the pantry, planning a proper kitchen garden with seeds Mrs. Hart had given her as a wedding gift. She learned the rhythm of Caleb's work, understanding when he needed help and when he needed to work through problems alone. In the evenings, they'd sit together going over the ranch accounts, Martha making notes in her neat handwriting while Caleb explained his plans for expanding the herd, for improving the breeding stock, for building a more secure future. He valued her opinion in a way that still surprised her, listening carefully when she questioned an expense or suggested an alternative approach. "You have a good head for numbers," he said one night, watching her calculate feed costs for the coming winter. "Better than mine." "You're perfectly capable with numbers," Martha replied. "You just think in terms of cattle and land. I think in terms of accounts and budgets, which is why we make a good team." He reached across the table and captured her hand. "I meant what I said before, Martha. You're my partner in this, not just my wife." The distinction mattered more than he probably realized. Martha had watched her mother fade into the background of her father's life, useful but unvalued, necessary but not cherished. What she had with Caleb was different. He sought her counsel, respected her judgment, and made her feel essential rather than merely convenient. But not everything was easy. The physical demands of ranch life were relentless, and there were days when Martha fell into bed so exhausted she could barely undress herself. Her hands developed new calluses, her back ached from hours bent over the garden or the laundry tub, and the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and mending wore on her. Worse was the isolation. Days would pass where the only people Martha saw were Caleb, Jake, and Tom. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, too far for casual visiting, and trips to town were infrequent necessities rather than social occasions. The silence of the vast landscape, which had seemed peaceful at first, sometimes pressed down on her like a physical weight. Caleb noticed her growing quietness one evening as they prepared for bed. "Something's bothering you." Martha considered denying it, but they'd built their marriage on honesty. "Sometimes the silence feels too heavy. I'm not used to going so long without conversation, I suppose. Female conversation, especially." He was quiet for a moment, and Martha worried she'd offended him. Then he said, "Sunday we'll go to town. You can spend the afternoon with Mrs. Hart while I handle some business. We'll make it a regular thing, every Sunday, barring emergencies." "You don't have to." "I want to. You gave up everything to come here, Martha. The least I can do is make sure you don't lose yourself in the process." But it was a small thing, but it mattered enormously. The Sunday visits became a lifeline, a chance to talk with Mrs. Hart and the other ranch wives who gathered at her house, to share recipes and remedies and the small frustrations of frontier life. The women welcomed Martha with a warmth that surprised her, curious about the woman who'd won Caleb Turner's notoriously guarded heart. "He's different since you arrived," Mrs. Cooper said one Sunday afternoon as they all sat sewing together. "Lighter, somehow, like a weight's been lifted." "Caleb was always too serious," Mrs. Hart added, "too focused on survival to think about living. You've changed that." Martha wasn't sure she believed she'd changed anything, but she treasured the friendship these women offered, the sense of community that made the isolation more bearable. Summer deepened into the hard heat of August, and the landscape transformed from green to gold to brown as the grass dried under the relentless sun. The creek that had run full and strong in spring dwindled to a trickle, and Caleb grew increasingly concerned about water for the cattle. "If we don't get rain soon, we'll have to move them to the high pastures earlier than planned," he said one morning, studying the cloudless sky with frustration. "But the grass up there isn't ready yet. They'll overgraze it, and we'll have nothing left for late fall." Martha had been managing the household accounts and knew exactly how precarious their financial situation was. They'd invested heavily in new breeding stock that spring, counting on good grass and sufficient water to bring the herd through to profitable sales in the fall. If the drought continued, they'd be forced to sell early at reduced prices, losing money they couldn't afford to lose. "What about the springs in the north section?" she asked. "You mentioned them when we first arrived. Could we move some cattle there?" "Those springs are on government land. I've been using them informally, but if other ranchers decide to move their stock there too, there won't be enough water for everyone." "Then we need to file proper claims before anyone else does." Caleb looked at her with surprise. "You know about water rights filing?" "My grandfather dealt with it back in Nebraska. It's complicated, but if we can prove we've been using those springs, we might be able to secure legal access." She stood and moved to the shelf where Caleb kept his ranch records. "Do you have documentation of when you first started using that range?" They spent the evening going through years of journals and notes, piecing together a history of Caleb's use of the government lands. Martha drafted a formal claim letter, citing regulations she remembered her grandfather explaining, and the next day Caleb rode to the land office in the county seat to file the paperwork. He returned 3 days later, exhausted but triumphant. "They accepted the claim. The springs are ours, legally recognized." "Martha, if you hadn't known about the filing process, I would have lost access completely. Another rancher had already inquired about those same springs." The victory felt sweet, but it highlighted something Martha was beginning to understand. Success in this territory required more than hard work. It required knowledge, strategy, and the ability to navigate legal and practical challenges that could destroy the unwary. As autumn approached, bringing blessed relief from the summer heat but no significant rain, new challenges emerged. Caleb received word that cattle prices were down across the territory, a result of too many ranchers trying to sell at once in response to the drought. "We're going to take a loss this year," he said grimly, showing Martha the figures. "Not enough to ruin us, but it'll be tight." Martha studied the numbers, her mind working through possibilities. What if we don't sell the full herd? What if we keep back the best breeding stock and wait for prices to recover? We need the money to get through winter. Do we? Martha pulled out her household account book. "I've been careful with expenses. We have enough preserved food to last through spring if we're conservative. The hay situation is adequate. If we sell just enough cattle to cover absolute necessities and keep the best stock for breeding, we'll be positioned to take advantage when prices improve." Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's a huge gamble. If prices don't recover, if we have a hard winter and lose stock, we could end up worse off than if we'd just sold everything now at the low price." "Life is a gamble," Martha said quietly. "We can play it safe and guarantee a small loss, or we can take a calculated risk for a potentially better outcome. But it's your decision, Caleb. This is your ranch." "Our ranch," he corrected firmly, "and you're right about this being a gamble worth taking. We'll do it your way." They sold only 50 head that fall, keeping back the prime breeding stock despite the immediate financial pressure. It meant a winter of careful economizing, of stretching supplies and making do. But Martha had lived through lean times before and knew how to make something from nothing. She canned and preserved everything the garden produced, supplemented their meat supply by learning to shoot well enough to bring down deer and rabbits, and found a dozen small ways to cut expenses without sacrificing necessities. When Caleb's coat tore beyond simple mending, she took apart an old blanket and fashioned a new lining. When they ran low on coffee, she stretched it with roasted chicory root. When soap supplies dwindled, she made her own from saved fat and lye. Caleb watched her resourcefulness with growing admiration. "Where did you learn all this?" "Necessity," Martha replied, stirring a pot of soap that smelled terrible but would clean effectively. 3 years of drought teaches you to waste nothing and value everything. As winter closed in, bringing the first serious snows in November, the ranch settled into a quieter rhythm. The cattle were brought down from the high pastures, the outbuildings were secured against the weather, and the long work of simply surviving the cold months began. Martha had never experienced a Wyoming winter, and its ferocity shocked her. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes, and the wind howled through the valley with a force that made the sturdy house shake. Snowdrifts piled higher than the fence posts, and there were days when venturing outside meant risking frostbite or worse. But inside the house, warmth and comfort prevailed. Martha kept the fire burning steadily, cooked hearty meals that sustained them through the brutal cold, and found ways to make their small home feel cozy despite the harsh world beyond its walls. In the evenings, she and Caleb would sit by the fire, Martha mending or knitting while Caleb carved small wooden items or worked on tack repairs, and they'd talk about their plans for spring, their hopes for the herd, their dreams for the future. It was during one of these quiet evenings that the first real test of their marriage arrived, in the form of a rider struggling through the snow. Caleb opened the door to find a half-frozen man, barely able to stay in his saddle. Together they got him inside, and Martha immediately began the work of warming him carefully. Too fast would be dangerous, while Caleb tended to the exhausted horse. "Name's William Graves," the man said through chattering teeth once he could speak. "I'm with the Territorial Livestock Association. I've been writing to all the ranches in the region with news." "What kind of news?" Caleb asked, his expression wary. "Cattle prices have dropped even further. There's talk of the big ranchers forming a cooperative to control supply and force prices back up. They're pressuring smaller operations to join or face being frozen out of the best markets." Martha and Caleb exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of pressure they'd feared. "What happens if we don't join?" Caleb asked. Graves warmed his hands around the mug of hot coffee Martha had pressed into them. "They'll make it difficult for you to sell. The cooperative will control access to the railroad yards, to the best buyers. Independent ranchers will be forced to accept whatever prices they can get from secondary markets." "That's extortion," Martha said sharply. "That's business, ma'am. The big ranchers are protecting their interests." After Graves had warmed sufficiently and accepted their offer of a bed for the night, no one could be sent back into that storm, Martha and Caleb retreated to their room to discuss the situation. "We can't join," Caleb said flatly. "The membership fees alone would wipe out what little reserve we have, and once we're in, they'll control our decisions, tell us when and where we can sell." "But if we don't join, we'll be shut out of the best markets," Martha countered. "We'll be forced to sell at even lower prices." "So we're trapped either way." Martha paced their small bedroom, her mind working through the problem from every angle. Finally, she turned to face Caleb. "What if we don't sell through the traditional markets at all?" "What do you mean?" "The military needs beef. The Indian agencies need beef. They buy directly from suppliers, don't they? What if we bypass the cooperative entirely and sell straight to government contracts?" Caleb's eyes widened. Government contracts are notoriously difficult to get. You need connections, references, proven reliability. But they pay fair prices, and they pay in cash. And they care about quality and delivery, not about which cooperative you belong to. Martha sat on the edge of the bed. Mrs. Hart mentioned that her late husband supplied beef to Fort Russell before he died. She might know who to contact. It's a long shot. Everything about this life is a long shot. But it's worth trying, isn't it? Caleb pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "When did you become such a strategist?" "Around the time I married a stubborn rancher who needed someone to help him think around problems instead of just through them." The next morning, after Graves had departed with warnings about deadlines for joining the cooperative, Caleb and Martha rode into town through the deep snow to speak with Mrs. Hart. The older woman listened to their situation and nodded thoughtfully. "My Henry did supply Fort Russell for years. I still have his contracts and correspondence. More importantly, I know Major Thornton, the supply officer. He's an honest man who values quality over politics." She disappeared into her study and returned with a wooden box full of letters and documents. "Take these. Use Henry's name as a reference. It won't guarantee anything, but it'll get your foot in the door." Over the next weeks, Martha drafted careful letters to military supply officers at 3 different forts, laying out what they could provide, referencing the late Mr. Hart's successful contracts, and emphasizing their commitment to quality stock and reliable delivery. She made copies of their breeding records, documented their herd's health history, and created a professional presentation that would have impressed a city businessman. "You could have been a lawyer," Caleb said, reading over her shoulder as she sealed the letters. "I'd rather be a rancher's wife." Even when being a rancher's wife means spending hours drafting business correspondence? Especially then. She turned in her chair to face him. "This is what partnership means, Caleb. You understand the cattle and the land. I understand contracts and negotiations. Together, we're stronger than either of us would be alone." The replies came in February when the snow was at its deepest and cabin fever had everyone in the valley on edge. 2 forts declined politely, citing existing contracts. But Fort Russell requested a meeting to discuss potential supply arrangements. "It's not a guarantee," Martha cautioned, though her heart was racing with excitement. "But it's a chance." The meeting was scheduled for early March, which gave them weeks to prepare their presentation and to worry about everything that could go wrong. It was during this tense waiting period that the second test arrived, this one more personal and infinitely more painful. Martha was in town collecting mail when she heard the whispers. 2 women standing outside the general store, their voices just loud enough to carry. Heard she was sent as a replacement for her sister. The real bride ran off rather than marry Caleb Turner. Poor man probably didn't even realize what he was getting until it was too late, trapped by honor into keeping the plain sister. Such a shame. Catherine Lowell was supposed to be a beauty. Can't imagine how disappointed he must have been. Martha stood frozen, the mail clutched in her hands, the words striking her like physical blows. She'd known people would talk, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the pity and derision in their voices, brought back every insecurity she'd thought she'd overcome. She finished her errands mechanically, maintaining a composed expression until she could escape to the wagon. The ride home was a blur, the women's words echoing in her mind. Replacement, plain sister, trapped by honor. By the time she reached the ranch, doubt had taken root like poison in her heart. Had Caleb truly chosen her, or had he simply made the best of a bad situation? Did he look at her and wish she was Catherine? Did he regret marrying the practical sister instead of waiting for someone he could actually love? She was in the kitchen preparing dinner when Caleb came in from afternoon chores, stamping snow from his boots and bringing the smell of cold air and horses with him. "Something wrong?" he asked immediately, reading her expression. "No, nothing's wrong." "Martha." He crossed to her, tilting her chin up so she had to meet his eyes. "Don't lie to me. What happened?" The whole story came tumbling out. The overheard conversation, the doubts it had stirred, the fears she'd been carrying since the day she arrived. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. What if they're right? What if you're only with me because you felt obligated? Because I was convenient and capable and you needed someone? Caleb's expression had grown increasingly dark as she spoke. When she finished, he took both her hands in his grip firm and warm. "Listen to me very carefully, Martha Turner. The day you arrived and told me the truth about why you'd come, I could have sent you straight back. No one would have blamed me. The contract was based on false pretenses, and I had every legal and moral right to refuse you. But I needed a lot of things, but I didn't need you specifically. I could have written to a dozen different matchmaking services, could have found another woman willing to come west. Hell, Mrs. Cooper's niece had been dropping hints for months that she'd be interested." He cupped Martha's face in his calloused hands. "I kept you because I wanted you. Not because I was trapped, not because I was desperate, but because from the first moment you started talking, I recognized something in you that I'd been looking for without even knowing it." "What?" "Strength, honesty, the kind of courage it takes to walk into the unknown and face whatever comes. You didn't hide who you were or try to be someone you thought I wanted. You were just yourself, practical, capable, honest Martha, who'd rather risk rejection than start a marriage with lies." His thumbs brushed away her tears. "Do you know what I thought when I saw you standing in Mrs. Hart's parlor?" Martha shook her head, unable to speak. "I thought, here's a woman who knows what hard work means. Here's someone who won't break when life gets difficult. Here's someone I could actually build something with." He leaned his forehead against hers. "And I was right. Everything we've accomplished these past months, navigating the drought, securing the water rights, finding alternative markets, we did that together. You're not my consolation prize, Martha. You're my partner, my equal, and the best decision I ever made." "But I'm not beautiful like Catherine would have been." "No, you're not beautiful like Catherine. You're beautiful like Martha, strong and real and mine." He kissed her softly. "I don't care what those gossiping hens in town think they know. They don't live here. They don't see you working beside me every day. Don't see how you've transformed this house into a home. Don't understand that what we have is worth more than any pretty face." Martha buried her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, letting his words sink into the wounded places in her soul. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have doubted you. You're human. Doubt happens. But Martha, when you feel that doubt creeping in, I need you to come to me. We face problems together, remember? That includes problems in here." He tapped her forehead gently, then moved his hand to rest over her heart. "And in here." That night, as they lay in bed with the wind howling outside, Caleb spoke into the darkness. "You want to know something? I'm glad Catherine ran away." Martha stirred against his shoulder. "What?" "I mean it. If she'd come as planned, I would have married her because I'd given my word. And we probably would have been miserable together, her resenting the hardship, me resenting her resentment. We would have survived, but we wouldn't have thrived." He tightened his arm around her. "Instead, I got you. I got a woman who chose this life, who fights for what we're building, who makes me believe we can survive anything as long as we face it together. So yes, I'm glad Catherine ran away because her running brought you to me." Martha pressed closer, feeling something tight and painful in her chest finally loosen. "I'm glad too." The next Sunday, Martha walked into church with her head high, wearing her best dress, and Caleb's mother's ring shining on her finger. When the two gossiping women she'd overheard tried to avoid her eyes, Martha walked straight up to them with Caleb at her side. "Good morning, Mrs. Fletcher. Mrs. Thompson," she said clearly. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The women stammered greetings, clearly uncomfortable. "I understand there's been some talk about how Caleb and I came to be married," Martha continued, her voice pleasant but firm. So let me be perfectly clear. My sister made a choice to pursue a different life. I made a choice to come west and build something real. Caleb made a choice to give me a chance to prove myself. And every day since, we've both chosen each other and this life we're creating together. If that's disappointing to anyone, well, that's their burden to carry, not ours. She smiled sweetly, linked her arm through Caleb's, and walked into the church, leaving the speechless women behind. That was magnificent, Caleb murmured. I learned from the best, Martha replied. You taught me that standing up for what's yours is part of surviving in this territory. Our marriage is ours, and I'm done letting anyone make me feel ashamed of it. March arrived with the first hints of spring, and with it came the meeting at Fort Russell. Caleb and Martha rode in together, Martha carrying her carefully prepared documents, and Caleb carrying samples of their best beef jerky and preserved meat to demonstrate quality. Major Thornton was a practical man in his 50s, more interested in facts than flattery. He listened as Caleb explained their operation, examined their breeding records, asked pointed questions about their capacity to deliver on schedule and in quantity. Then he turned to Martha. Mrs. Turner, your letters were very professional. Unusually so for a ranch wife, if you don't mind my saying. I don't mind at all, Major. My grandfather believed in thorough documentation and clear communication. I've simply applied those principles to our ranch management. And you keep the books? I do. Would you like to see them? She spread their account ledgers on the table, showing him 3 years of meticulously documented expenses, inventory, breeding records, and sales. Thornton studied them with the eye of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. These are better maintained than some military supply records I've seen, he admitted, and your herd health documentation is exceptional. We've had problems with suppliers delivering sick animals. How do you ensure quality? For the next hour, Martha and Caleb tag-teamed the presentation, each playing to their strengths. Caleb explained their breeding program and grazing rotation. Martha detailed their health protocols and quality control measures. Together, they painted a picture of a ranch that was small but exceptionally well managed. Finally, Thornton leaned back in his chair. I'll be honest with you. We typically work with larger operations, but we've had issues with those operations treating us as just another customer, delivering whatever they can spare rather than what we actually need. You're proposing something different, a dedicated supply relationship where you prioritize our needs. We are, Martha confirmed. We can't provide the volume the big ranches can, but what we provide will be consistent, high quality, and delivered exactly when and where you need it. And if we sign a contract with you, you'll bypass the cooperative entirely? We will, Caleb said firmly. We'd rather work directly with customers who value quality than through a cooperative that values only control. Thornton nodded slowly. All right, I'm willing to offer you a trial contract. 50 head delivered in June, another 50 in September. If the quality meets our standards and delivery is on schedule, we'll discuss a longer-term arrangement. It wasn't the large contract Martha had hoped for, but it was a foot in the door, and that was all they needed. We accept, Caleb said, extending his hand. As they rode home in the lengthening afternoon light, Martha felt something shift inside her. They'd done it. Against pressure from the cooperative, against financial uncertainty, against the doubts and gossip and challenges, they'd found their own path forward. We make a good team, Caleb said, echoing the words he'd spoken months before. We do, Martha agreed, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. But even as they celebrated this victory, they had no idea that their greatest test was still to come. Spring came hard and fast that year, the snow melting in torrents that turned the creek into a raging river and the meadows into seas of mud. Martha stood at the window watching the water rush past, grateful for Caleb's foresight in building the house on high ground, but worried about the lower pastures where their cattle grazed. We need to move them, Caleb said, coming up behind her. If this keeps up, the bottomland will flood completely. They spent 3 exhausting days moving cattle to higher ground, working in rain that never seemed to stop, their clothes perpetually soaked and their boots caked with mud so thick it added pounds to every step. But they got it done, and when the creek finally crested and began to recede, they'd lost only 2 calves to the flood, a miracle compared to what some neighboring ranches suffered. Mrs. Hart brought news when they next came to town. Cooper lost 30 head in the flood, The Hendersons lost their entire hay barn when the creek jumped its banks. You two were lucky." "Not luck," Caleb said quietly. "Martha insisted we move the cattle early. I wanted to wait another day." "Sometimes the best luck is marrying someone smarter than you are," Mrs. Hart said with a knowing smile. As April turned to May, the ranch transformed into a vision of green abundance. The rains that had caused such destruction also brought lush grass that had the cattle fattening beautifully. Martha's garden exploded with growth, and she worked from dawn to dusk, managing the overwhelming bounty, planting, weeding, harvesting early crops, and already planning for the preservation work that would consume her summer. It was during one of these busy mornings, when Martha was on her knees in the garden pulling weeds, that Jake came running from the barn. "Mrs. Turner, there's a fancy carriage coming up the road." Martha stood, shading her eyes against the sun. Sure enough, a well-appointed carriage was making its way toward the ranch, entirely out of place in this rough country. Visitors were rare enough, but visitors in expensive carriages were unheard of. Caleb emerged from the barn, his expression wary. Together they watched as the carriage pulled up in front of the house and the driver climbed down to open the door. A woman stepped out, and Martha's heart stopped. Catherine. Her sister looked exactly as Martha remembered. Golden hair, perfectly coiffed despite the long journey, skin like porcelain, features delicate and refined. She wore a traveling dress of deep green silk that probably cost more than everything Martha owned, and she surveyed the ranch with barely concealed distaste. Behind her, a man emerged from the carriage. He was handsome in a slick, superficial way, with oiled hair and a mustache waxed to sharp points. His suit was expensive but flashy, the attire of a man who wanted to appear more successful than he actually was. "Martha," Catherine said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of affected sweetness, "what a quaint little place you found yourself." Martha was aware of Caleb standing rigid beside her, of Jake and Tom frozen near the barn, of her own hands still dirty from garden work. She wiped them on her apron and met her sister's eyes steadily. "Catherine, this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is." Catherine glided forward, her companion following like a well-trained dog. "Aren't you going to introduce us to your husband?" "Caleb, this is my sister Catherine, and—" Martha looked at the man, waiting. "Thomas Whitmore," he supplied, bowing slightly, "Catherine's husband." So the snake oil salesman had actually married her. That was surprising. "Please, come inside," Martha said, because courtesy demanded it, even though every instinct screamed to send them away. "I'll make tea." The house had never felt smaller than it did with Catherine in it. Her sister's eyes cataloged everything: the simple furniture, the worn rugs, the lack of decorative touches that marked it as a working ranch house rather than a proper home. "How rustic," Catherine murmured, settling delicately onto the sofa as if afraid it might soil her dress. "You've certainly embraced the frontier lifestyle, haven't you, Martha?" Martha set the kettle on the stove, her hands steady through sheer force of will. "I've embraced my life. What brings you here, Catherine?" Can't a sister visit without ulterior motives? Not when that sister ran away rather than honor her commitments and hasn't been heard from in nearly 9 months. Catherine's perfect smile faltered slightly. Thomas stepped forward, his voice smooth and practiced. "Now, ladies, there's no need for hostility. We've come because we heard about your good fortune, Mrs. Turner. Word travels, even to Boston." "What good fortune would that be?" Caleb asked, speaking for the first time. His voice was cold, and Martha could see the tension in his shoulders. "Why, your military contract, of course, and the rumor that cattle prices are finally recovering. After such a hard year, you must be relieved." Thomas smiled, showing too many teeth. Catherine felt terrible about the misunderstanding that brought Martha here instead of her. "We wanted to make amends." "There was no misunderstanding," Martha said flatly. "Catherine made a choice. She ran away with you rather than honor her agreement. I came in her place to spare my family the shame." "Such a noble sacrifice," Catherine said, but there was an edge beneath the sweetness now. "And look how well it turned out. You got a husband after all, even if he was meant for someone else." The words were designed to wound, to remind Martha that she was second choice, replacement, the sister nobody wanted. A year ago, they would have struck deep. But Martha had spent months building a life with Caleb, proving herself, earning her place. She was no longer the overlooked girl who'd boarded a stagecoach full of doubt. "Caleb was never meant for you, Catherine. You made that clear when you abandoned him before you'd ever met him. Martha poured tea with steady hands. So again, what brings you here? Thomas and Catherine exchanged glances. Then Catherine sighed dramatically. Very well, since you insist on being direct. Thomas's business ventures in Boston didn't work out as planned. We found ourselves in somewhat reduced circumstances. Temporarily reduced, Thomas added quickly. I have several promising opportunities in San Francisco, but we need capital to pursue them. Understanding dawned cold and clear. You want money. We want what's fair, Catherine said, her voice hardening. That contract with Caleb included a significant payment to our family, money that should have gone to me as the intended bride. Since you took my place, benefited from my agreement, it's only right that we share in your success. Martha set down the teapot with deliberate care. The money went to our family to save the farm from ruin, money that was spent before I ever arrived here. You have no claim to it. Don't I? Catherine leaned forward, all pretense of sweetness gone. I was the one Caleb wanted. I was the one he saw in that photograph, the one he wrote those letters to. You stole my life, Martha. You always were jealous of me, and you saw your chance and took it. The accusation was so absurd, so divorced from reality, that Martha almost laughed. I stole nothing. You threw it away. Because I didn't want to rot away on some isolated ranch. Catherine's composure was cracking. But that doesn't mean you had the right to take what was mine. Caleb married you thinking he was getting me. That's fraud, Martha. In some places, that could be grounds for annulment. The threat hung in the air like poison. Martha felt Caleb move beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, but he remained silent, letting her handle this battle. Caleb knew exactly who he was marrying, Martha said quietly. I told him the truth the moment I arrived. He had every opportunity to refuse me, and he chose not to. Our marriage is legal and valid, and you have no claim on it or us. Thomas stood, trying to regain control of the situation. Ladies, please. We're not here to threaten anyone. We simply thought, given your good fortune and our family connection, you might be willing to help us. A small loan, perhaps, just to get us established in San Francisco. How much? Caleb asked, his voice like granite. $500 would be sufficient to— No. The single word cut through Thomas's practiced pitch like a knife. No? Catherine stood, her face flushing with anger. You'd refuse your own sister-in-law when she's in need? I'd refuse two people who showed up here with threats and manipulation, trying to extort money from my wife. Caleb moved to stand beside Martha, his arm settling around her waist. You made your choices, Miss Lowell. Excuse me, Mrs. Whitmore. You chose Thomas over the life you'd agreed to. You chose Boston over Wyoming. Those were your decisions, and you live with the consequences. But Martha chose my life! Catherine's voice rose to a near shriek. She took the husband that was meant for me, took the ranch, took everything. I never wanted you, Caleb said, his voice cutting and cold. I wanted the woman described in those letters, hardworking, practical, ready for frontier life. But that woman never existed, did she, Catherine? Those letters were lies, pretty words designed to hook a husband you had no intention of actually coming to. Martha might have written them for you, knowing you, but she never would have written them for herself. Catherine's face went white. How did you— The handwriting in the account books matched the handwriting in the letters. It took me exactly 1 day to figure out that Martha had written your correspondence for you. He looked at Catherine with something close to pity. So no, you didn't lose anything when you ran away. You were never suited for this life, never wanted it, and would have been miserable here. The only fraud would have been you pretending to be someone you weren't. That's not fair, Catherine whispered, but the fight was draining from her voice. Life rarely is, Caleb replied. But here's what is fair. I'm going to give you and your husband a night's lodging and a hot meal because that's what decent people do for travelers. Tomorrow morning, you'll leave and you won't come back. If you're truly in financial difficulty, I'll give you $50 to help you reach San Francisco. That's more than you deserve and less than you're asking for, but it's all you're getting. Thomas began to protest, but Caleb held up a hand. Those are the terms. Take them or leave. Martha watched her sister's face cycle through emotions, rage, hurt, calculation, and finally resignation. Catherine had always been able to charm men into giving her what she wanted, but Caleb was immune to her particular brand of manipulation. "We'll take it," Catherine said finally, her voice small. The evening meal was awkward and silent. Martha served the food she'd prepared, her hands steady despite the turmoil inside her. This was her sister, the girl she'd grown up with, shared a room with, protected and covered for. And yet Catherine had come here not to reconnect or apologize, but to claim ownership of a life she'd never wanted in the first place. After dinner, Martha showed Catherine to the spare room while Thomas was directed to sleep in the barn with Jake and Tom. When they were alone, Catherine turned to face her sister. "You always were the strong one," she said quietly. "I used to hate that about you. Hate how nothing ever seemed to break you, how you just kept working and enduring while I needed beauty and attention to feel like I mattered." "Catherine, let me finish." Her sister's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I thought running away with Thomas was my chance at a real life. Excitement, romance, the things I'd read about in novels. But Boston was expensive and Thomas was—" She laughed bitterly. "Thomas was exactly what Papa said he was. A smooth talker with no follow-through. We're not just in reduced circumstances, Martha. We're broke, completely broke." Martha felt an unwelcome surge of sympathy. "What will you do? Go to San Francisco and hope Thomas's latest scheme actually works, or find some other way to survive?" Catherine looked around the simple room. "You know what's funny? I always thought you were settling for less, accepting whatever life gave you because you weren't strong enough to demand more. But you weren't settling at all, were you? You were choosing substance over show, choosing real partnership over romantic fantasy. You chose better than I did." "It's not too late to choose differently," Martha said softly. "Yes, it is. I'm married to Thomas, for better or worse. Mostly worse." Catherine managed a weak smile. "But maybe in San Francisco we'll find our footing. Maybe I'll learn to appreciate what I have instead of always wanting more." "I hope you do." Catherine moved toward the door, then paused. "He loves you, you know, Caleb. I saw it in how he looked at you, how he stood beside you. That was never going to be me. Even if I'd come as planned, that depth of partnership, I could never have given him that. You could have tried." "No." Catherine shook her head. "I'm not built for trying, Martha. I'm built for taking the easy path and hoping it leads somewhere pleasant. You're built for the hard path, for fighting and earning and building. You were always the better sister. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." She slipped out before Martha could respond, leaving her standing alone in the small room, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Not for what was lost, but for what had never been possible between them. Caleb found her there a few minutes later. He pulled her into his arms without a word, letting her cry against his chest. "She's my sister," Martha said when she could speak, "and I don't even know her. Some people are meant to be in our lives, and some people are meant to teach us lessons and move on. Maybe Catherine is the latter. I wanted to help her. Even after everything, I wanted to. I know you did. That's who you are, Martha. Generous and kind even to people who don't deserve it." He tilted her face up. "But you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Catherine made her choices. All you can do is make yours." The next morning, Catherine and Thomas departed with Caleb's $50 and a basket of food Martha had packed despite everything. Catherine hugged her sister briefly at the carriage door. "Thank you," she whispered. "And Martha, stop doubting yourself. You won. You got the better life, the better husband, the better everything. Own it." Then she was gone, the carriage rolling away down the valley road, taking with it the last ghost of Martha's old life. Caleb stood beside Martha as they watched the carriage disappear. "You all right?" "I think so. It's strange. I spent so many years in her shadow, feeling like I wasn't enough because I wasn't her, and now she's jealous of me." "You were never in her shadow, Martha. You were just standing in the wrong light." He took her hand. "Come on. We have work to do." And there was work. Always work. The June delivery date for their military contract loomed, and they spent weeks selecting the best cattle, making sure every animal met their exacting standards. Martha updated the health records obsessively, documented every detail, ensured their presentation would be flawless. When they finally delivered the 50 head to Fort Russell, Major Thornton inspected each animal personally. His thoroughness was intimidating, but Martha had confidence in their stock. Finally, the major straightened and nodded. "This is exactly what we asked for. Healthy animals, well-bred, properly documented. When can you deliver the September shipment?" "First week of September, unless you need them sooner," Caleb replied. "First week is perfect. And Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner, I'd like to discuss expanding our contract for next year. The quality of what you're providing is exceptional." They rode home with a check for more money than they'd seen in a year and the promise of future contracts that would secure their ranch's survival. Martha felt lightheaded with relief and triumph. "We did it," she said as they crested the ridge overlooking their valley. "We actually did it." "You did it," Caleb corrected. "You're the one who thought of government contracts, who drafted the letters, who maintained the records that impressed Thornton. I'm just the person who raises the cattle." "We did it together," Martha insisted. "That's what partnership means." Summer passed in a blur of hard work and careful planning. Martha's garden produced abundantly, and she spent long days canning and preserving, building up stores for the coming winter. The cattle fattened on rich grass, and Caleb's careful breeding program began to show results as this year's calves grew strong and healthy. In August, news arrived that the cooperative's attempt to control prices had collapsed. Too many members had cheated, selling outside the agreement, and the organization had fractured under the weight of its own corruption. Cattle prices were recovering naturally as supply and demand found equilibrium. "We were right to stay independent," Martha said, reading the newspaper account. "If we'd joined the cooperative, we'd be tied up in legal battles right now instead of fulfilling profitable contracts." "Your grandfather would be proud," Caleb said. "You learned his lessons well." The September delivery went as smoothly as the June one, and Major Thornton was pleased enough to sign a contract for the following year, 100 head delivered in 2 shipments, with prices that guaranteed them not just survival, but actual profit. As autumn painted the valley in gold and crimson, Martha stood in her garden harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first frost. She was 24 years old, married to a man who valued her partnership as much as her presence, and building a life that was entirely her own. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Caleb rode toward her on his bay gelding, and even at a distance she could see the smile on his face. "What is it?" she called. He dismounted and swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her protests about her dirty hands. "Cooper just told me the railroad is planning a new route through the valley. There'll be loading yards within 5 miles of our ranch by next spring." Martha understood immediately what that meant. "We won't have to drive cattle to distant markets, and we'll have first access to the new yards. Everything is coming together, Martha. The ranch, the contracts, the future we're building, it's all working." She looked at him, at this man who'd given her a chance when he could have refused her, who'd valued her strength instead of mourning her lack of beauty, who'd chosen her every day since. "Because we're working it together." "Always together," he agreed, and kissed her there in the garden with the mountains rising around them and the future spreading out like the vast Wyoming sky. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the world in shades of amber and gold, Caleb pulled out the old journal he'd kept since founding the ranch. He turned to a blank page and handed Martha the pen. "Write today's date," he said. She did, curious. "Now write this. Today we stopped being people who survived and became people who thrive. Today we chose abundance over scarcity, partnership over independence, and forever over temporary. Today we choose each other, again, as we will every day for the rest of our lives." Martha wrote the words carefully, her handwriting neat and precise in the journal that documented their shared history. When she finished, Caleb added his own note beneath hers. "Martha came to me as a replacement, sent instead of the sister who ran, but there was never any replacing to be done. She was always the one I was meant to find, the partner I needed, the woman I choose, not because she was convenient or capable or necessary, but because she is herself, strong, honest, brave Martha, who stood in a parlor and told me the truth, even though it terrified her. She was never second choice. She was always the right choice. Forever and completely, she was always mine." Martha read his words through tears, and when she looked up, Caleb was watching her with an expression of such tenderness that her heart felt too large for her chest. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily despite having never spoken them before. "I should have said it sooner, but I love you, Caleb Turner." "I love you too." he replied. From the moment you climbed into that wagon and chose to stay at the ranch instead of safe in town, I think I loved you. I just didn't have the sense to recognize it yet. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun slipped behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed peacefully. The creek burbled over stones worn smooth by centuries of flow. The house behind them stood solid and warm, filled with the evidence of their shared work and shared lives. Martha thought about the frightened woman who'd stepped off a stagecoach 9 months ago, expecting rejection and prepared to accept it as her due. That woman had been so certain of her own unworthiness, so convinced that being useful was the best she could hope for. But she'd been wrong. Useful was good, but it wasn't enough. What she had with Caleb transcended mere utility. They were partners, yes, but they were also companions, lovers, friends. They'd built something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. A marriage, a home, a life. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked. "I'm thinking that I'm grateful Catherine ran away. I'm grateful for the drought that sent me here. I'm grateful for every hard thing that happened because it led me to this moment, to this place, to you." "Me too," Caleb said quietly. "Every hardship, every setback, every moment I thought I might lose everything. It was all leading me to you." As winter's first cold breath whispered through the valley and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance, Martha Lowell Turner sat beside her husband and felt completely, utterly, triumphantly home. She'd been sent as a replacement for the beautiful sister who'd run, but she'd arrived as herself, plain, practical, determined Martha. And in arriving as herself, in refusing to pretend or diminish or apologize for who she was, she'd found what she'd been searching for all along. Not visibility, though she had that now in Caleb's eyes that saw her completely. Not usefulness, though she was essential to everything they built. Not even love, though they had that in abundance. What she'd found was belonging. The deep, unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly who she was meant to be with, living exactly the life she was meant to live. She'd been chosen. Not as second best or consolation prize, not out of obligation or necessity, but deliberately and completely. Caleb had chosen her, and every day since they'd chosen each other, forever and fully their own. The end.